My son-in-law, a man who measures the world in square footage and dollar signs, called to inform me that his parents would be moving into my house. Not next month, not next week, but tomorrow. He saw a 75-year-old widower, a relic living in a space he considered wasted. He never once saw the man whose hands built these walls, the man who laid this foundation with a woman who was the foundation of his entire life. The next morning, as their moving truck idled at the curb, I smiled and handed my son-in-law a single crisp envelope. He thought it was a welcome note. He didn't realize it was an eviction notice for the future he had planned for me. Before I explain how the quiet ink on old city blueprints can shout louder than a rich man's demands, do me a favor. Let me know in the comments where you're listening to my story from. And if you've ever had to draw a line in the sand to protect what's yours, hit that like and subscribe button because you'll understand the satisfaction that comes next. The fork paused halfway to my mouth. The scent of the roasted chicken I'd made for myself, a small comfort in a house that had grown too quiet, suddenly vanished. The phone had rung with the shrill urgency that always meant it was either an emergency or my son-in-law Todd. Tonight, it was Todd, and his voice slid through the receiver smooth and cold as polished granite. He didn't bother with pleasantries, never did. "Eli," he began, the name sounding like a transaction. "Hope you're sitting down. Big news. Mom and Dad are moving in with you tomorrow." I said nothing. My throat felt tight, the food I'd just swallowed sitting like a stone in my stomach. The silence stretched, but it didn't make him uncomfortable. He was used to filling silences with his own self-importance. "We got a fantastic cash offer on their house in Buckhead," he continued, his voice buzzing with the thrill of a successful deal. "Couldn't pass it up. And we were thinking your place is perfect. It's way too big for just one person, and it'll be great for you to have some company." He made it sound like he was doing me a favor, gifting me with the presence of two strangers who looked at me with the same polite condescension he did. My eyes drifted across the dining room to the closed door at the end of the hall. Rose's room. Our room. It had been her sanctuary, filled with her books, her sewing kit, the faint scent of the lavender she loved. It was the one part of the house I kept exactly as she'd left it. As if on cue, Todd's voice sliced through my thoughts. "They can take Rose's old room. It gets the best morning sun. Just need you to clear out her things before they get there. They're aiming for 10 a.m. He said her name, my wife of 48 years, with the casual indifference of someone reading an item off a shopping list. He wasn't just claiming a room. He was erasing a life, my life with her. Still, I held my silence. In my younger days, a fire would have erupted from me. My voice would have cracked like thunder. But age teaches you that silence has its own power. It forces the other person to reveal themselves, to lay all their cards on the table. Todd took my silence as agreement, as the quiet compliance of an old man who should be grateful for any attention at all. "Great," he said, his tone brisk and final. "This works out perfectly for everyone. Amelia will be thrilled. See you in the morning." And then the click. The line went dead. He hadn't asked a single question. He hadn't waited for a single word in response. He had delivered his terms and ended the conversation. I slowly placed my fork back on the plate. The chicken was cold now. The warmth had left the room, replaced by an invasive chill. I sat there in the house I had designed, in the house where my hands had measured and cut every piece of wood, feeling like a trespasser in my own life. Todd saw these walls as assets. He saw the land as an opportunity. He saw me as a placeholder, a temporary guardian of a property he and my daughter Amelia would one day inherit. He thought because my skin was dark and my hands were worn from a lifetime of honest labor that my mind had grown soft. He assumed that because I was old, I was also weak. He had made a declaration of war over the phone, and in the profound quiet of my home, I accepted it. He had no idea who he was dealing with. He had no idea what these old worn hands were still capable of building, or what they were capable of taking apart. He thought he was moving his parents in. He had no idea he was moving himself out of my life, out of my will, and out of the future he had so carefully and so arrogantly designed for himself at my expense. The war had begun not with a shout, but with the deafening silence of a dial tone. After the line went dead, the silence that rushed back in was heavier than before. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a man alone with his thoughts. It was an invasive, suffocating silence, the kind that buzzes in your ears and makes a room feel like a tomb. I didn't move. I just sat there, my hands still resting on the receiver of the old landline phone, my knuckles white. My gaze fell upon the chair opposite me, the one that had been empty for 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. Rose's chair. It was a simple oak chair, one I had built myself, sanding the wood until it was as smooth as riverstone. She had stitched the cushion for it a pattern of sunflowers that had since faded with the sun and time. It was just a chair, but tonight it felt like a monument to everything I was about to lose. Todd's words echoed in the quiet. "They can take Rose's old room." He said it so easily, as if her memory was just old furniture to be cleared out for new occupants. He didn't know, couldn't possibly comprehend what that room was. It wasn't just a space with 4 walls. It was the place I last held her hand. It was where her laughter still seemed to hang in the air on quiet nights. It held the scent of her, a mix of lavender and old books that I sometimes thought I could still catch when the wind was just right. And he was going to give it away, to strangers. People who would see a room and nothing more. I pushed my plate away, my appetite completely gone. I got up from the table, my joints creaking in protest, and walked slowly through the house. My house. Every inch of it was a story. I ran my hand along the plaster of the hallway wall, feeling the subtle imperfections. I remembered the summer we plastered it ourselves, covered head to toe in white dust, laughing as Rose accidentally smudged a handprint on my cheek. We left it there, a small, perfect flaw that only we knew about. I passed the doorway to the living room, my fingers tracing the height marks we had penciled in for Amelia as she grew from a wobbly toddler to a young woman ready to leave for college. "To the moon, Daddy," she used to shout, stretching on her tiptoes. Now she was a stranger, complicit in this hostile takeover of her own childhood. This house wasn't an investment. It was a diary written in wood and nails and sweat and shared dreams. Rose and I bought this piece of land when it was nothing but overgrown weeds and the city skyline was a distant promise. People said we were crazy. "Nothing out here but red clay and mosquitoes, Eli," they'd warned. But Rose saw it. She had a vision. She stood right where the kitchen is now, her hands on her hips, and said, "This is where we'll watch our daughter do her homework. And this," she said, pointing to the empty space that would become our porch, "is where we'll grow old together watching the fireflies." We poured the foundation with our own hands, mixing the concrete until our backs ached. I framed the walls, and she was right there with me, holding the boards steady, her determination a force of nature. We didn't build a structure. We built a life. And Todd, with his expensive suits and his belief that anything could be bought and sold, was about to bulldoze it all. Not with a machine, but with a phone call, with the casual arrogance of a man who had never built anything that truly mattered. He saw a depreciating asset managed by an old man. He didn't see the sacred ground he was about to desecrate. The internal conflict began to rage inside me. It was a storm of grief for my wife. A profound aching disappointment in my daughter, and a cold, hard anger that was slowly crystallizing in my chest. For years I had bitten my tongue. For Amelia's sake I had tolerated Todd's subtle condescension, his backhanded compliments about my simple life. I had watched him steer my daughter away from the values Rose and I had taught her, replacing them with a hunger for status and material things. I had stayed quiet, believing that was the price of peace. But this was different. This wasn't just disrespect. This was an invasion. This was an attempt to erase my past, to overwrite my history with Rose. I walked back to the dining table and sat down, not in my chair, but in hers. I looked out the window at the old oak tree we had planted as a sapling on our first anniversary. It stood tall and strong against the darkening sky. And in that moment, sitting in Rose's empty chair, I knew my silence was over. He had mistaken my patience for weakness. He had mistaken my grief for surrender. He was about to learn just how wrong he was. My fingers, stiff with age, felt heavy as I picked up the phone again. I had to believe this was a misunderstanding, a gross overstep by Todd that my daughter, my Amelia, would be horrified to learn about. I dialed her number from memory, the sequence of digits, a familiar rhythm from a lifetime of calls, from checking in on her at college to hearing the news that I was going to be a grandfather. With each beep of the keypad, I held on to a dwindling sliver of hope. She would fix this. She would be my ally. The phone rang once, twice, and then her voice came on the line, though it sounded distant, strained. "Hi, Dad." "Amelia, honey." I started trying to keep my own voice even, to not let the tremor of anger seep through. "I just got off the phone with Todd." I paused, giving her a chance to jump in to say she had no idea what he was up to. Instead, there was a sigh on the other end of the line. A weary, resigned sigh that told me everything I needed to know before another word was spoken. "Dad, I was going to call you," she said, her voice laced with a guilt that was immediately infuriating. It was the voice of someone who knew they were wrong but had already decided to go through with it anyway. Was he supposed to call me? I asked the question, sharp and cold. Was he supposed to tell me that I have strangers moving into my house tomorrow morning, that I'm expected to clear out your mother's room like she was nothing but a temporary guest? The words tumbled out harsher than I intended, but the wound was too fresh, too raw. I could almost hear her flinch on the other end. "It's not like that, Dad," she said, her tone shifting from guilty to defensive. "Please just try to understand. This is for the best." "The best for who, Amelia?" I shot back, my voice rising despite my best efforts. "The best for me to have my home invaded and my wife's memory erased without so much as a discussion. Is that what's best for me?" I heard muffled sounds, the murmur of a man's voice in the background. Todd was there, coaching her, feeding her the lines. Her next words confirmed it. "We all have to make sacrifices for family," she said, the phrase sounding hollow and rehearsed. "Todd's parents are in a tough spot. They needed to sell their house quickly and they have nowhere else to go right now. It's just temporary." A cold, heavy clarity began to settle over me, pushing aside the initial shock and anger. It was like watching a blurry picture slowly come into sharp, ugly focus. "They sold their house?" I asked quietly. "Gary and Brenda Miller are in a tough spot. The last I heard, their house was worth 3 times what this one is." The line was silent for a moment, and I knew I had her. I had poked a hole in the story Todd had constructed for her to tell me. "Well," she stammered, "it's complicated. The money from the sale. It's for an investment, for a down payment on Todd's new development project. It's a huge opportunity for us, Dad, for our future." And there it was. The truth laid bare in all its greedy, transactional ugliness. This wasn't about helping family in need. This was about using me. My home wasn't a refuge for her in-laws. It was a free hotel to enable their son's business deal. They had cashed out their assets to fund Todd's ambition, and I was expected to shoulder the inconvenience. The hurt was a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. My own daughter. The little girl whose height I had marked on the doorframe, the young woman I had walked down the aisle, saw me not as her father, but as a resource, an obstacle to be managed. "So, this is my sacrifice," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "My peace, my home, my memories of your mother. That's my contribution to Todd's business deal." "Dad, please don't be so dramatic," she said, her voice turning sharp, impatient. The guilt had evaporated, replaced by the frustration of having her plan questioned. "It's a big house. You're all alone. It makes logical sense." Logical sense. That's what my life had been reduced to. A problem of logic to be solved by her and her husband. The love, the history, the soul of this place meant nothing. "I have to go," she said abruptly. "Todd and I are going over the contracts. We'll see you tomorrow morning. Please, Dad, just don't make this difficult." The click of the phone was more final, more painful than the first one. Todd had cut me off like a business associate. My daughter had cut me off like a loose end. The hope I had clung to just minutes before was gone, turned to ash. I was completely and utterly alone in this fight. And in that cold, stark loneliness, something new began to grow. A quiet, unbending resolve. They thought I was a feeble old man. They thought I would just step aside. They had forgotten what I was. I was a builder. And I would not let them tear down what I had built. My daughter's words, "Don't make this difficult," hung in the air long after she had hung up. Difficult. She thought I was being difficult. As if I were a stubborn child refusing to share a toy, not a man being evicted from his own life. The conversation replayed in my mind, but one part of it snagged a loose thread on a perfectly woven lie. Her excuse about Todd's parents being in a tough spot. It didn't feel right. Gary and Brenda Miller had always lived a life of casual luxury, a world away from the one Rose and I had built with our hands. A tough spot for them was having to choose between a cruise to Alaska or one to the Mediterranean. I let the thought simmer. The initial wave of pain and betrayal was beginning to recede, leaving behind the cold, hard bedrock of suspicion. I needed to understand. I couldn't let it go. So I picked up the phone one more time and dialed her number again. She answered on the first ring, her voice sharp with annoyance. "Dad, what is it I told you? We're busy." I ignored her tone. "Amelia, I just have one question," I said, my voice low and steady. "If Gary and Brenda needed a place to stay so desperately, why didn't they just rent an apartment for a few months? With the money from their house sale, they could afford to rent the finest penthouse in Atlanta." There was a pause. I had cornered her with simple logic, and she was unprepared. It's not that simple," she stammered. I could hear Todd whispering furiously in the background again, a venomous hiss I couldn't quite make out. "Why isn't it simple, Amelia?" I pressed, keeping my voice calm. "Help me understand." She let out an exasperated sigh, a sound that wounded me more than any shout could have. It was the sound of a daughter who saw her father as a burden, an obstacle to her own happiness. "Because the money is tied up," she finally burst out, her frustration boiling over. "The sale closed and the funds have to go directly into the escrow for the new project to secure the land. There's a deadline. We could also really use the cash flow right now." And there it was. The truth delivered not in a confession, but in a moment of sheer frustration. We could also really use the cash flow right now. It wasn't about them. It was about her and Todd. It was all about the money. A profound, chilling silence fell between us. In that silence, years of small, seemingly insignificant moments began to click into place, forming a dark and undeniable mosaic. I remembered Todd a year ago sitting at my kitchen table, casually asking about my property taxes under the guise of being helpful. "Just want to make sure you're not overpaying Eli," he had said with that slick, reassuring smile. I remembered him asking about the neighborhood zoning laws a few months later, disguised as idle curiosity about his real estate business. I remembered the loan I gave them for their new car, the credit card debt I paid off when they were overwhelmed. Each one had been presented as a separate one-time crisis. I saw it now. They weren't crises. They were calculated withdrawals from the bank of my goodwill. This wasn't a sudden plan born of opportunity. This was the final move in a long, patient game of chess I never even knew I was playing. They hadn't just taken advantage of a situation. They had engineered it. They had their own parents sell their home, funneling that money directly into Todd's project, and had designated me, my home, and my life as the solution to the resulting inconvenience. I was nothing more than a line item in their budget, a cost-saving measure. The hurt I felt just moments ago was being burned away by a new, unfamiliar heat. It was anger, but not the hot, quick-tempered anger of my youth. This was a cold, dense, and heavy anger settling deep in my bones. It was the anger of a man who had been played for a fool by his own child. They saw a 75-year-old man, a widower lost in his memories, an easy mark. They had mistaken my quiet nature for weakness. They had mistaken my love for a bottomless resource to be drained. They had forgotten that the same hands that built this house with love and care could also dismantle a threat with cold precision. "I see," I said into the phone, and my voice was so calm, so devoid of emotion, that it startled even me. "Thank you for clarifying, Amelia. That's all I needed to know." I hung up the phone before she could reply. I didn't need to hear any more of her coached excuses. The fog had lifted. I knew exactly what I was facing. This wasn't a family squabble. This was a siege. And they had severely, catastrophically underestimated the man defending the fortress. Hanging up the phone on my own daughter felt like severing a limb. The finality of it left a phantom ache, a void where a sacred connection used to be. I sank into Rose's chair, the oak solid and unyielding beneath me, and the cold anger that had momentarily fortified me began to give way to a tide of bitter memories. My daughter's words, "We could also really use the cash flow right now," echoed and twisted, becoming a key that unlocked a dusty room in my mind, a room filled with past concessions and ignored red flags. I saw them now not as isolated incidents of a young couple struggling to find their footing, but as a calculated pattern of exploitation. It started small, of course. It always does. I remembered the first time about 5 years ago. Amelia had called in tears. Todd's car, a flashy German sedan he couldn't really afford, had broken down, and the repair bill was astronomical. "We're just in a tight spot this month, Dad," she had cried. "Todd feels terrible having to ask." I didn't hesitate. I went to the bank the next morning and withdrew a significant sum from my retirement savings money Rose and I had painstakingly put away. When I gave them the check, Todd had looked me in the eye, his face a mask of earnest gratitude. "Eli, I promise you this is the last time," he had said, shaking my hand firmly. "We'll pay you back every cent as soon as my commission check comes in." The commission check never seemed to materialize, and the debt was quietly forgotten, dismissed as a gift I was happy to give. A year later, it was credit card debt. They had, in Amelia's words, gotten a little carried away with home renovations. The truth was, they were living far beyond their means, trying to keep up with the wealthy families in their new upscale neighborhood. Again, I stepped in. This time, Todd wrote up a formal repayment plan on a crisp sheet of letterhead from his real estate firm. It looked official, impressive. He laid out monthly payments they would make for the next 2 years. They made exactly 3 of them before the payments stopped. When I gently inquired, Amelia told me they were restructuring their finances, and it was better for their credit score to focus on other things. It was all smoke and mirrors, a performance of responsibility designed to placate the old man while they continued to bleed him dry. The memories kept coming, each one a fresh sting of betrayal. The family vacation to Hawaii that I ended up funding because their hotel booking fell through. The private school tuition for my grandson that they just couldn't swing one semester. Each time there was a plausible story, a sense of urgency, and a solemn promise from Todd that this was the absolute last time. And each time I chose to believe them. I see that now. It was a choice. I chose to ignore the gnawing doubt in my gut because I wanted to see the best in my daughter. I wanted to believe in the man she had chosen to marry. I wanted to maintain the peace to avoid the kind of ugly confrontation that could splinter a family. I didn't want to admit to myself that my daughter, the same little girl who used to fall asleep on my chest listening to my heartbeat, had become a stranger, someone who saw her father as a safety net with no limit. My naivete felt like a sickness in my stomach. I had been so busy looking at the world through the lens of a loving father that I had failed to see the predators circling. Todd wasn't just an ambitious, slightly arrogant son-in-law. He was a master manipulator. He knew exactly which buttons to press, how to leverage Amelia's affection for me and my own desire for family harmony. He had used my love as a weapon against me. And Amelia, my Amelia, had let him. She had stood by, perhaps even helped craft the narratives that allowed this slow, steady draining of my resources and my dignity. Sitting there in the deepening twilight, the ghosts of past generosities mocking me, I felt the last remnants of paternal softness harden into something else. It was no longer just about saving my house. It was about reclaiming my self-respect. They had mistaken my kindness for a weakness to be exploited. It was time to show them that my kindness had a limit, and they had just crashed right through it. They thought the old man was a pushover. They had no idea the storm they had just awakened. The house was completely dark now, the last vestiges of daylight long gone. I hadn't bothered to turn on a single lamp. I preferred the shadows. They felt honest, a true reflection of the gloom that had settled in my soul. I sat in that chair, Rose's chair, for what must have been hours. The world outside went on. I could hear the distant rumble of traffic, the faint sound of a neighbor's television. But inside these walls, time had stopped. It was frozen at the exact moment my daughter chose a business opportunity over her father. The anger I had felt earlier had burned itself out, leaving behind the cold gray ash of profound disappointment. This was a grief deeper than the one I felt when I lost Rose. When she died, I lost my future. Tonight, I had lost my past. All the years I had poured into raising Amelia, all the sacrifices Rose and I had made, all the love we had given her, it all felt like it had been erased, rendered meaningless. I thought about Rose. I thought about her fierce, protective love for Amelia. Rose would never have allowed this to happen. She would have seen through Todd's superficial charm from the very beginning. She had a kind of vision for people, an ability to see the deep, hidden currents beneath the surface. She would have stood like a lioness at the door and told Todd exactly where he could put his plans. But I was not Rose. I was quieter, more inclined to seek peace than to wage war. And they had counted on that. They had weaponized my nature against me. They had built their entire strategy on the assumption that the quiet old man would simply sigh, step aside, and accept his diminished place in the world. They expected me to fade quietly into the background of my own home, a living ghost in a house full of memories. As I sat there shrouded in darkness, a different memory of Rose surfaced. It wasn't of her gentle smile or her warm embrace. It was of her strength. I remembered a time when a developer tried to buy out our entire block to build a soulless apartment complex. Our neighbors were scared, ready to sell for whatever they were offered. But Rose organized them. She spent weeks in the city archives digging through old property records. She stood up at the town hall meeting, her voice clear and strong, and presented a case based on historical preservation laws that no one even knew existed. She saved our neighborhood. She didn't do it by yelling or making threats. She did it with intelligence, with patience, and with an unshakable belief in what was right. A flicker of that fire, her fire, ignited within me. The despair began to recede, burned away by a slow-rising heat. I would not let them desecrate her legacy. I would not let them turn the home she built with her vision and her love into a boarding house for their own convenience. The disappointment in my daughter was still there, a permanent aching wound, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was clarifying. I finally understood that protecting my home was not an act of aggression against Amelia. It was an act of love for the values Rose and I had lived by. My silence was over, but I would not fight this battle on Todd's terms. This wouldn't be a shouting match. It wouldn't be an emotional confrontation. This would be a battle of foundations, of blueprints, of legal bedrock. He was a real estate developer. He thought he knew the game of property and ownership, but I was the man who had laid the foundation of this house with his own 2 hands. I knew its history down to the last nail. A new strength flowed through my veins. It was the strength of purpose. I got up from the chair, my movements no longer slow and defeated but deliberate and steady. I walked to the old roll-top desk in the corner of the living room, a piece of furniture I had inherited from my own father. I switched on the small green banker's lamp, and the sudden pool of light felt like a sunrise. I opened the bottom drawer, the one filled with old documents, warranties for appliances that no longer existed, and stacks of old letters. Tucked away at the very back was a small black address book, its leather cover cracked and worn with age. My fingers, surprisingly nimble, flipped through the pages. The names were a roll call of a life-lived friends who were gone, old colleagues, distant relatives. Then I found it. A name I hadn't spoken in years, but a man I had never forgotten. The ink was faded, the handwriting belonging to a younger, stronger version of myself. Next to his name I had written, "Attorney at Law," but that had been crossed out. Underneath it, I had jotted down a new number for a place called the West Side Community Center. I stared at the name, a bastion of integrity and old-school loyalty in a world that seemed to have forgotten both. Marcus Vance. I picked up the phone. The sun rose this morning, just as it always does, a silent, impartial spectator to the dramas of the world. It sent its golden shafts of light through the living room window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. But the light brought no warmth, no comfort. It only served to illuminate the battlefield. Sleep hadn't come. Not the real restorative kind, anyway. I had drifted in and out of a shallow, restless state, my mind a churning sea of past conversations and future dread. When the first birds began to sing, I gave up the pretense of rest and rose from my chair. I hadn't made it to the bedroom. I had spent the night right here, a century in my own home. I started to walk, my bare feet padding softly on the hardwood floors I had installed 4 decades ago. This wasn't a purposeless ramble. It was a pilgrimage. Every step was a deliberate act of remembrance. I started in the hallway. My hand grazed the wall, my fingers finding a slight, almost imperceptible ripple in the plaster. Rose's handprint. She'd left it there by accident that summer we did the plastering ourselves. I had wanted to smooth it over, the perfectionist in me wanting a flawless finish. But she had grabbed my hand, her eyes sparkling with laughter. "No," she'd said. "Leave it. It's us. We're not flawless, Eli. We're just real." Todd and his parents, with their perfect clothes and their perfect house in Buckhead, wouldn't understand a flaw like that. They would see it as something to be fixed, to be covered up. I moved on, pausing at the door frame leading into the kitchen. The faint pencil marks were still there, a ladder of lines climbing up the wood, each one dated in Rose's elegant script. Amelia, age 3. Amelia, age 7. Amelia, age 12. The highest mark was just below my own eye level, dated the day she left for college. A young woman ready to take on the world, her eyes full of the same dreams Rose and I once had. What would that young woman think of the person she had become? The person who could so casually agree to displace her own father, to dismantle her own history for the sake of a business deal. To her, they were probably just scuffs on the paint, imperfections to be erased when they redecorated. To me, they were chapters of a sacred text. In the kitchen, the scent of yesterday's roasted chicken was gone, replaced by the neutral smell of a room at rest. I could almost superimpose the memory of 1,000 other smells over it. The smell of Rose's cinnamon rolls on a Sunday morning, the rich aroma of her beef stew simmering on a cold winter's day. It was the scent of a happy, well-loved home. I tried to imagine the smells that would soon replace it. The smell of Brenda Miller's expensive, cloying perfume. The aroma of whatever bland, health-conscious food they would cook. It would be an alien scent, an olfactory invasion that would smother everything Rose had been. I walked to the back of the house and stood before the door to Amelia's childhood bedroom. I pushed it open. It was mostly a guest room now, but some of her old self remained. A faded crayon drawing of our family 3 stick figures holding hands under a smiling sun was still stuck to the wall with yellowed tape. Her old collection of novels sat on the bookshelf, their spines cracked from countless readings. This room was a museum of the daughter I thought I knew. A girl who was kind, who was thoughtful, who would have been horrified at the very idea of what was happening today. The contrast between the girl who had lived in this room and the woman on the phone last night was a chasm I couldn't bridge. This wasn't a home tour. It was a pre-battle ritual. I was arming myself not with weapons, but with memories. Every story embedded in these walls, every scuff on the floor, every ghost of laughter was a piece of my armor. Todd and his family saw a piece of real estate. They saw square footage, property value, a convenient solution to a logistical problem. They were blind to what was really here. They couldn't see the love, the struggle, the joy, the grief. They couldn't see the very soul of a life. I finished my pilgrimage at the closed door to Rose's room, my room. I didn't open it. I just placed my hand flat against the wood. This was the heart of the fortress. This was the ground they could not have. They were coming at 10 o'clock to claim a house. They had no idea they were walking into a sanctuary, and its keeper was finally ready for them. My pilgrimage through the house eventually led me to the living room and to the silent giant that stood against the far wall, the piano. It was an old upright, a Baldwin from the 50s, its dark mahogany wood still holding a deep, rich luster under a thin veil of dust. It was the single most expensive thing Rose and I had ever bought together. We had saved for 2 years to afford it, eating simple meals and mending old clothes, all because Rose believed a house wasn't a home without music. For 3 years now since she had passed, it had been silent. I didn't have the heart to play it, and its silence was a constant low-level ache in the background of my life. A monument to a melody that had ended. I approached it slowly as if it were a sleeping animal I didn't want to startle. My fingers, calloused and stiff from a lifetime of working with wood, reached out and gently lifted the keyboard cover. The 88 keys, a perfect, silent smile of ivory and ebony, gleamed in the morning light. They were cool to the touch. I didn't press down. I just rested my fingertips on them and closed my eyes. And just like that, the silence was broken. Not by a sound in the room, but by a sound in my memory as vivid and clear as if it were happening right now. I could see her. A 6-year-old Amelia perched on the piano bench, her small legs dangling a foot above the pedals. She was all pigtails and impatient energy wiggling from side to side. And beside her was Rose. My Rose. Her back was straight, her hands resting in her lap, her face a perfect portrait of patient love. I could hear her voice soft and melodic as the music she was trying to teach. "All right, sweet pea," she was saying. "Let's try it again. Middle C. Find me middle C." Amelia's little brow would furrow in concentration, her tiny finger hovering over the keys before landing with a dissonant plink. She'd giggle a bright bubbling sound that filled the entire house. "Oops," she'd say, and Rose would just smile, taking Amelia's small hand in her own. "That's okay," she'd say. "Every mistake is just a step towards getting it right. Let's find it together." I could feel the warmth of that memory, the sheer unadulterated happiness of that moment. I could smell the lemon polish Rose used on the wood. I could hear the simple, clumsy notes of "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" slowly, painstakingly taking shape under their combined hands. It was more than just a music lesson. It was a lesson in life, in patience, in the quiet joy of creating something beautiful together. In that moment, this piano wasn't a piece of furniture. It was the heart of our family, the place where love was given a voice. Then a new image, ugly and intrusive, crashed into the sanctuary of my mind. I saw another pair of hands on these keys, not Rose's gentle guiding hands or Amelia's small learning hands. I saw the hands of Brenda Miller with her long, blood-red nails and her gaudy diamond rings. I could almost hear her sharp nasal voice cutting through the warmth. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Todd," I imagined her saying. "Are we really keeping this enormous thing? It's so dated. It completely throws off the aesthetic of the room." I could see Todd nodding in agreement, that placating, dismissive smile on his face. "Don't worry, Mom. We'll have it hauled off to Goodwill first thing next week." I snatched my hand back from the keys as if they had suddenly become red hot. The beautiful memory shattered its pieces like sharp glass in my gut. The pain was dizzying. It was a terrible, blended agony. The old familiar grief of missing Rose was a deep, constant ache. But this new pain, this betrayal by my daughter, was a fresh, twisting knife. They weren't just taking a house, they were taking this memory, this sacred piece of my history. They were going to haul away the sound of my wife's patience and my daughter's laughter and sell it for scrap. I stared at the silent keys. The little girl who learned to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, right here, was now the woman who was allowing this to happen. She was letting them silence the music for good. The realization settled on me with a dreadful weight. Protecting this house wasn't just about protecting an old man's memories. It was about defending the memory of the family we once were. It was about standing guard over the ghost of that little girl with the pigtails, the girl who still existed in the grain of this wood and in the heart of this silent piano. With a deep breath, I slowly, deliberately lowered the keyboard cover. The gentle thud echoed in the quiet room. It was the sound of a door closing on the past. It was time to stop remembering and start fighting. I looked at the clock on the mantel. It was almost 7 a.m. It was time to call Marcus. While I waited for a respectable hour to call Marcus, I stood at the living room window, coffee cup, warming my hands, and looked out at the world. My world, or what was left of it. For 40 years, this window had framed a view of a community, a tapestry of lives interwoven with my own. I used to look out and see Mrs. Henderson tending to her prize-winning roses in the yard, to my left, her straw hat a fixture of every summer morning. I used to see the Jackson family's house across the street, a constant source of life and noise, with kids' bicycles always strewn across the lawn and the savory smell of Mr. Jackson's barbecue pit wafting over on Saturdays. We were a neighborhood of front porches and shared cups of sugar, of watching each other's kids grow up and keeping an eye on each other's homes when they were away. But the tapestry had begun to unravel. The threads were being pulled out one by one. The Hendersons were the first to go about 5 years ago after Mr. Henderson passed. Their children, who lived out of state, sold the house to a numbered company for a price that seemed shockingly high at the time. A young white couple moved in, tore out the rose bushes, painted the warm brick a sterile, fashionable gray, and put up a high fence. We never learned their names. They didn't use the front porch. The Jacksons left 2 years ago. They fought to stay, but the property taxes kept climbing, a silent, relentless pressure squeezing the life out of them. They sold to a developer and moved south to be with their grandkids. Their house was torn down in a single afternoon. Now, where Mrs. Henderson's roses once bloomed, there's a 2-story modern box of glass and steel that looms over my own modest home. And where the Jacksons' kids used to play, a new, even larger structure is rising. A monolith of concrete and steel beams, the skeleton of a 4-unit luxury condo building, crawling with workers even at this early hour. The sounds of our neighborhood were once children's laughter and friendly greetings. Now it's the shriek of power saws and the percussive slam of nail guns. It's the sound of a world being unmade and remade into something I no longer recognize. A conversation from last Christmas swam up from the depths of my memory, suddenly sharp and chilling in its clarity. Todd, holding a glass of expensive wine, had gestured out this very window. "You're sitting on a gold mine, Eli," he'd said with a conspiratorial wink. "This neighborhood is the next big thing. The growth potential is off the charts." I had just smiled, thinking he was just making business talk. Then he said something that had puzzled me at the time. "The only thing holding back the real value of this block is the historical inventory." Historical inventory, that's what he called my home. That's what he called the houses of my friends and neighbors. We weren't people with lives and memories. We were inventory, obstacles on a balance sheet. The pieces began to slide into place, forming a picture of such cold, predatory calculation that it made me feel sick. This gentrification, this revitalization, as Todd called it, wasn't a natural process. It was a hunt. And Todd was one of the hunters. He and his company were the ones buying up the historical inventory, tearing it down and replacing it with sterile boxes for people with more money than roots. The Millers, the Jacksons, Mrs. Henderson, they hadn't just moved away. They had been pushed out casualties in a quiet, bloodless war for land. And now I understood with a dreadful certainty why my house specifically was so important to his plan. It wasn't just a free place for his parents to live. My house with its old oak tree and its welcoming front porch was the last original home on this side of the street. I was the last piece of historical inventory. I was the holdout. My presence was a stubborn, inconvenient reminder of what this neighborhood used to be, a blemish on the clean, modern, and highly profitable vision he was building. Getting me out, getting his family in, wasn't just about saving money. It was about conquering the final square on the chessboard. My home was the prize. Looking at the steel skeleton rising across the street, I realized this fight was bigger than just my family. It was about my community. It was about every brick that had been bulldozed, every rosebush that had been uprooted. I was fighting for the ghosts of my neighbors, for the memory of what we once were. My personal betrayal was just one small part of a much larger, greedier story. Todd hadn't just insulted me. He had declared war on my entire world, and he was about to find out that this old piece of inventory still had some fight left in him. The clock on the mantel ticked past 7:30. It was a reasonable hour. Still, my hand hovered over the phone, a strange hesitation gripping me. It had been at least 4 years since I'd last spoken to Marcus Vance. Our wives had been close, and after Rose passed, and then his own wife a year later, we had drifted apart, lost in our own separate oceans of grief. Calling him now felt like an intrusion, like dragging him into a mess that wasn't his. But the image of Brenda Miller's hands on Rose's piano, the sound of the nail guns across the street, pushed the hesitation aside. This was not a time for pride. I dialed the number for the West Side Community Center. A young, cheerful voice answered on the second ring. "West Side, this is Maya speaking." "Good morning," I said, my voice sounding rusty to my own ears. "I'd like to speak with Marcus Vance, please." "Of course," she said. "May I ask who's calling?" "Tell him it's an old friend," I said. "Eli Coleman." I heard her call his name in the background and then the sound of the phone being passed. A moment later, a different voice came on the line. It was deeper, slower, with a gravelly texture like old whiskey poured over stones. "Eli Coleman. My God, man, is that really you?" A wave of relief washed over me, so potent it almost buckled my knees. It was the relief of a man lost in the wilderness who suddenly hears a familiar voice. "It's me, Marcus," I said, a small, weary smile touching my lips for the first time in what felt like an eternity. "How have you been, old friend?" "I've been," he said, and in those two words I heard the shared experience of loss, of carrying on, of simply continuing to be. "But I have a feeling you didn't call to reminisce about the old days. You sound heavy, Eli. What's wrong?" He had always been like that, Marcus. He could read the weather in a man's voice. He didn't waste time on small talk when something important was on the line. This was the moment. I could have poured it all out, the phone calls, the betrayal, my daughter, the piano, the condos. I could have spent 20 minutes venting my pain and my anger. But that wasn't why I called. Emotion was a luxury I couldn't afford right now. I needed a strategist, not a shoulder to cry on. "Marcus," I said, my voice steady and clear, stripped of all sentiment. "I'm sorry to call you out of the blue. I need your help. I need your eyes. Not the eyes of a friend, but the eyes of the lawyer you used to be." There was a pause on his end, but it wasn't a pause of hesitation. It was a pause of deep, focused listening. "I'm listening," he said, his voice losing its friendly gravel and taking on the sharp, focused edge I remembered from that old town hall meeting. "I need you to look at some papers for me," I continued. "My property deeds, the old blueprints for the house, the original zoning maps for this entire block if I can find them, everything." I didn't offer any context. I didn't mention Todd or Amelia. I didn't have to. The nature of the documents I was asking for told their own story. It was a story about land, about ownership, about a fight. "When?" he asked. It was the only question that mattered. "Today," I said. "As soon as possible. Things are happening, Marcus. They're happening fast." "Understood," he said without a moment's hesitation. The loyalty in that single word was a balm to my wounded spirit. "The center's open all day. You bring whatever you've got whenever you're ready. I'll clear my desk and put the coffee on." "I'll be there in an hour," I said. "Thank you, Marcus." "Truly." "Don't thank me yet, Eli," he said, his voice turning grim. "Let's see what we're up against first. Just get here." I hung up the phone. For the first time since Todd's call, I felt a flicker of something other than grief and anger. It was hope, but it was a cold, hard, and pragmatic kind of hope. It was the hope of a soldier who has just been handed a rifle. I was no longer just a sad old man wandering through the museum of his past. I was a man with a mission, an ally, and a destination. My pilgrimage of memory was over. Now it was time to gather my weapons. I walked over to the old roll-top desk, the one that held 40 years of history in its dusty drawers, and began to search. The phone call with Marcus was like a starter pistol firing in the dead quiet of a race that had already begun. The paralysis that had held me captive was gone, replaced by a surge of adrenaline, a clarity of purpose that felt like a long-forgotten friend. I wasn't just an old man anymore. I was a man with an appointment and objective. I had an hour to prepare. My first stop was the roll-top desk, a piece of furniture as old and stubborn as I was. It was a chaotic archive of a life stuffed with things that were too important to throw away, but not important enough to be properly organized. I began to excavate. The drawers groaned in protest as I pulled them open, releasing the faint, sweet scent of old paper and cedar wood. I sifted through layers of history, my honorable discharge papers from the Army Amelia's report cards, stacks of sepia-toned photographs of people whose names were lost to time. I wasn't just looking for documents. I was digging through the geological strata of my own life. Finally, in a thick manila envelope at the bottom of the deepest drawer, I found the first piece of my arsenal. The deed. Not a recent copy from the county clerk's office, but the original document from 1975. The paper was thick and fibrous, the type almost crisp with age. I ran my thumb over the raised seal of the state of Georgia. I saw my own signature, a young man's confident scrawl next to Rose's, her elegant, hopeful loops. This single piece of paper was the genesis of everything. It was a promise we had made to each other, a declaration that this small patch of red Georgia clay would be our kingdom. It wasn't a financial asset. It was a covenant. I placed it gently to one side. Next, I needed the blueprints. I knew exactly where they were. In the hall closet inside a heavy cardboard tube that I hadn't opened in 30 years were the original drawings for the house. I pulled them out, the tube hissing as I unsealed it. I carefully unrolled the brittle yellowed paper on the living room floor. There it was, the entire house rendered in my own hand with precise architectural lines. Every wall, every window, every doorway. I could still feel the phantom ache in my back from framing the roof, the sting of sawdust in my eyes. Todd saw a house that was too big for one person. I saw this, a tangible record of my own sweat, my own skill, my own love. These blueprints were more than just a plan. They were my testimony. I rolled them back up with the reverence of a scholar handling an ancient scroll. The last and most important pieces were the ones I wasn't sure I still had. During that fight with the developer years ago, Rose had become a woman possessed. She had spent weeks at the city hall and the county records office collecting documents like a squirrel gathering nuts for winter. She had amassed a small library of zoning regulations, historical preservation statutes, and old surveyor's maps of our neighborhood. After we won, I had packed it all into a sturdy banker's box and stored it in the attic, thinking its purpose had been served. Now I prayed it was still there. The attic was hot and stuffy, smelling of cedar and thyme. I pulled the chain for the single bare bulb, casting long, distorted shadows across a landscape of forgotten things. And there it was in the far corner, tucked under an old army blanket. The box was heavy. I wrestled it down the rickety attic ladder and carried it to the living room, a cloud of dust puffing out as I set it down. I lifted the lid. It was all there. A treasure trove. Maps from the 1960s showing the original property lines of the entire block. Copies of city ordinances with sections highlighted in faded yellow by Rose's hand. Notes she had scribbled in the margins. It was a complete legal and historical record of our community. It was Rose's legacy. Her foresight, her tenacity, her love for this place, all captured in this box. Todd thought he was playing a simple game of real estate. He had no idea he was stepping onto a battlefield that Rose had already fortified years ago. I began to assemble the documents on the dining room table, laying them out like a general planning a campaign. The deed, the blueprints, the box of Rose's research. This was my story. This was my truth. It was a truth written in ink and sweat in love and legal code. I gathered everything and placed it carefully into my old leather briefcase, a bag I hadn't carried in over a decade. The brass clasps clicked shut with a sound that felt decisive final. I stood in the hallway, briefcase in hand, and took one last look around. The house was no longer a tomb of memories. It was a fortress, and I was walking out its gates to meet the enemy. The 10-minute drive to the West Side Community Center was a journey through 2 different cities. I started in my own neighborhood, a place that was rapidly becoming a foreign country to me. I passed the skeletons of new condo buildings, their modern angular frames wrapped in colorful corporate banners promising luxury urban living. I saw young white couples jogging with expensive strollers, talking on their phones, their faces set with the same kind of ambitious, focused intensity I always saw in Todd. They were the new settlers colonizing the world I had helped build, and they didn't even see me. I was just part of the scenery, an old black man in an old car, a relic from a time they were actively trying to erase. But as I drove south, the landscape began to change. The glass and steel towers gave way to weathered brick and painted murals. The corporate logos were replaced by hand-painted signs for family-owned bakeries, barbershops, and bookstores. The high fences disappeared, replaced by open porches and small, well-tended gardens. The air itself seemed to change, to lose its sharp competitive edge and become something warmer, more familiar. I was coming home, not to my house, but to my people, to the world that had shaped me. The West Side Community Center wasn't an impressive building. It was an old converted warehouse, its brick facade covered in a sprawling, vibrant mural depicting the history of the neighborhood. It looked a little worn around the edges, but it hummed with a palpable energy. As I pulled into the small parking lot, I could see life happening through its large windows. A group of elderly men were hunched over a chessboard. A young woman was patiently tutoring a small child at a corner table, and a bulletin board by the entrance was a chaotic but beautiful collage of event flyers, job postings, and children's artwork. This place was the polar opposite of Todd's world. His world was about exclusion, about building fences and creating exclusive spaces. This place was about inclusion. It was a sanctuary built not of expensive materials, but of shared purpose and mutual respect. I took a deep breath before getting out of the car, the heavy leather briefcase feeling like an anchor in my hand. For the first time all morning, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a man walking into his command center. The moment I stepped inside the cheerful young woman I'd spoken to on the phone, Maya looked up from the front desk and smiled. "Mr. Coleman, it's an honor to meet you. Marcus is waiting for you in his office. Can I get you some coffee?" Her welcome was so genuine, so devoid of the polite transactional courtesy I was used to from Todd and Amelia, that it almost disarmed me. "Thank you, young lady," I said, my voice a little thick. "Coffee would be wonderful." She led me down a short hallway to a door with a simple hand-painted sign that read, "Marcus Vance, Director and Chief Coffee Maker." The office was small and wonderfully cluttered. Books on law history and community organizing were stacked in precarious towers on every available surface. The walls were covered in maps of the city, framed photos of neighborhood kids, and what looked like decades of awards and commendations. It wasn't the office of a high-powered attorney. It was the den of a man deeply, passionately invested in his community. And there he was. Marcus Vance was sitting behind the desk, not looking at a computer screen but reading a physical newspaper. He was older, of course, just like me. His hair was completely white, and he wore a simple, comfortable-looking cardigan. He looked tired, the way all men our age look tired, but his eyes, when he looked up at me, were as sharp and intelligent as I remembered. He folded the paper, stood up, and walked around the desk. He didn't offer a handshake. He pulled me into a brief, solid hug, clapping me on the back. "Eli," he said, his voice full of unspoken history. "It's good to see you, brother, even under circumstances I suspect are not good at all." He gestured to the worn leather chair opposite his desk. A steaming mug of black coffee was already waiting for me on a coaster. He hadn't forgotten how I took it. He sat down, leaned forward, and folded his hands on the desk. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't ask me to tell him the story. His eyes just said, "I'm here. I'm listening. We're in this together." I lifted the heavy briefcase and placed it on the desk between us. The sound of the leather hitting the wood was a dull, authoritative thud. It was a declaration. I unsnapped the 2 brass latches. The sharp clicks echoed in the quiet office. "Marcus," I said, my voice finally finding its strength, "let's go to war." With a silent nod, Marcus gestured for me to begin. I opened the briefcase and started to lay out the contents on his large, cluttered desk, creating an island of my own history amidst his sea of community business. First, I placed the original deed, its aged paper, a stark contrast to the bright white documents on his desk. Then came the rolled-up blueprints, which I carefully weighted down at the corners with a stapler and a heavy mug. Finally, I lifted the banker's box, Rose's box, and set it in the center of the table. The air in the small office seemed to grow still charged with the weight of the past. Marcus didn't speak. He just watched, his sharp eyes taking in each item. He was a man who understood that sometimes the most important parts of a story are told not with words, but with artifacts. When everything was laid out, he leaned forward, putting on a pair of silver-rimmed reading glasses that were perched on his head. He was no longer just my old friend. He had transformed into the lawyer I remembered, a man about to dissect a case. He picked up the deed, first his fingertips handling the old document with a practiced, gentle respect. He read it slowly, his lips moving almost imperceptibly. He grunted a low sound of appreciation. "They don't make them like this anymore," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "Ironclad, no loopholes for greedy descendants to exploit." Rose always was thorough. He set it down and turned his attention to my hand-drawn blueprints, a small, sad smile touching his lips as he recognized my distinctive drafting style. Then he turned to the box. He lifted the lid and for a moment just stared at the contents. It was a chaotic mess to the untrained eye, a jumble of folded maps, photocopied pages of dense legal text, and notebooks filled with Rose's meticulous handwriting. But to Marcus, it was a goldmine. He reached in and pulled out a thick-bound copy of the Atlanta City Planning Ordinances from 1978. "My God," he whispered, a note of awe in his voice. "I haven't seen one of these in 20 years. Everything's online now, a searchable database. Developers like your son-in-law, they think the only laws that exist are the ones that show up in a keyword search." He began to leaf through the pages, his legal mind awakening, sparks firing in his eyes. He wasn't just reading. He was hunting. He pulled out one of Rose's notebooks and laid it open next to the ordinance book. "Look at this, Eli," he said, his voice quickening with excitement. He pointed to a paragraph of dense, almost unreadable legal jargon in the official book, and then to Rose's notes beside it. She had translated it into plain English with a note in the margin that read, "Protects against non-conforming land use for properties of historical significance." "She did the work for us," Marcus said, shaking his head in wonder. "She did all the heavy lifting 30 years ago." For the next hour, we fell into a deep, focused silence, broken only by the rustle of old paper and the occasional grunt or murmur from Marcus. He was a man excavating a lost city, and I was the native guide who had lived there his whole life. He pulled out old surveyor maps, tracing the property lines with his finger, comparing them to a modern city map he had pinned to his wall. He saw how the neighborhood had been carved up, how the old generous lot lines had been sliced and diced to maximize profit. He saw the systematic dismemberment of our community in a way I had only ever felt. "This is complex," he said, finally leaning back in his chair and rubbing his tired eyes. "The laws have been amended and overwritten a dozen times since these were printed. A modern lawyer would take one look at this box and say it's useless, that it's all obsolete." He paused, looking at me over the top of his glasses. A slow, dangerous smile began to spread across his face. "But they'd be wrong. Developers, especially arrogant ones, are lazy. They only pay attention to the current laws. They never dig deep enough. They don't realize that sometimes the old laws, the ones everyone has forgotten about, sometimes they have roots that are still alive, buried deep in the bedrock of the city's charter." He leaned forward again, his eyes gleaming. "And I think your wife, God rest her soul, found one of those roots." For what felt like an eternity, the only sounds in the room were the dry whisper of aging paper and the low, rhythmic ticking of a clock on Marcus's wall. I sat and watched my friend work my own anxiety a tight knot in my stomach. He was my last hope, and I watched him navigate the labyrinth of the past, praying he would find a way out for me. He moved with a methodical slowness, cross-referencing Rose's handwritten notes with the dense pages of the official city ordinances. He would read a passage, then flip through one of her notebooks, his brow furrowed in concentration. More than once he shook his head, hitting a dead end where a newer law had clearly nullified an older one. With each dead end, my knot of anxiety tightened. I had started to lose hope, beginning to think that maybe Todd was right, that the world had moved on and the old rules no longer mattered. But then something shifted. Marcus, who had been methodically turning pages, suddenly stopped. His hand froze midair. He leaned closer to the book, his nose almost touching the page. He traced a single paragraph with his index finger, reading it once, then a second time, his lips moving silently. He took off his glasses, polished them with a handkerchief, put them back on, and read it a third time. A low whistle escaped his lips. "Well, I'll be," he breathed, his voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and pure unadulterated glee. "Rose, you magnificent woman, you found it." He looked up at me, and his eyes were no longer just the eyes of a tired old lawyer. They were blazing with the thrill of discovery. "Eli," he said, his voice dropping to an excited whisper, "listen to this." He turned the heavy ordinance book around so I could see it, though the tiny, dense print was a blur to my eyes. He pointed to a small, unassuming section tucked away at the bottom of a page, a paragraph that a less patient man would have skipped over entirely. "Article 7, Section 4B, he read aloud, his voice gaining strength with every word. "The Community Heritage Trust provision. It states, and I quote, any property owner residing within a designated historical residential zone whose primary structure predates the 1970 city charter reserves the inalienable right to irrevocably deed their property to a registered nonprofit community trust for the express purpose of cultural preservation, historical education, or direct community benefit." He looked at me, waiting for it to sink in. I just stared back, confused. The legal jargon was a thick fog. "Marcus, what in God's name does that mean in English?" I asked. He chuckled, a deep, triumphant sound that echoed in the small office. "It means, my friend, that we've found our weapon. It's a ghost law. A provision so old and so specific that it fell through the cracks. It was never repealed, just forgotten. What it means is that you, Eli Coleman, as the owner of a house built before 1970 in this specific zone, have a special right. A right no other homeowner in those new condos has." He leaned forward, his voice electric. "You have the right to give your house away." I stared at him, dumbfounded. "Give it away, Marcus. I'm trying to save my house, not give it away." "Exactly," he boomed, slapping his hand on the desk, making the coffee cups jump. "Don't you see? You don't give it to your family. You don't give it to a developer. You give it to a trust, a non-profit entity with a stated mission. An organization like, I don't know, the Westside Community Center." The pieces started to click in my mind, a slow dawning realization that was so audacious it took my breath away. "Once the property is deeded to the trust," he continued, speaking faster now, "its purpose is legally locked in. It can only be used for community benefit. It can never be sold for profit. It can never be torn down. And the transfer, Eli, the transfer, is immediate and legally binding the moment you sign the papers. Your family, your son-in-law, they have no legal claim. They become irrelevant." The knot of anxiety in my stomach didn't just loosen. It vanished, replaced by a dizzying sense of possibility. This was a move of such elegant, unexpected power that it felt like something out of a dream. It wasn't just a defense. It was a checkmate. Todd was playing checkers, moving his pieces across the board in a straight line, thinking he was about to capture my king. He had no idea I was about to flip the entire board over. "So," I said slowly, the plan beginning to take shape in my mind, "if I were to do this, my house would no longer be my house." "Correct," Marcus said. "It would belong to the community. You could, of course, have a lifetime lease to remain living there as its custodian, written into the trust agreement." I looked at the box of Rose's research. It wasn't just a collection of old papers. It was a message in a bottle, a warning, and a weapon she had prepared for a battle she somehow knew was coming. A Tia Haivong, a ray of hope. No, it was more than that. It was a roadmap to victory. I stared at Marcus, the words, "give your house away," echoing in the quiet office. It was a concept so counterintuitive to my struggle that my mind couldn't immediately grasp it. It sounded like surrender, like the ultimate defeat. Give away the very thing I was fighting to keep. I must have looked as bewildered as I felt, because a patient, understanding smile spread across Marcus's face. He leaned back in his chair, a professor about to explain a profound but simple truth to a struggling student. Eli, you have to stop thinking like a homeowner and start thinking like a general, he began, his voice calm and instructive. Right now, your house is a prize to be won. To your son-in-law, it's a pot of gold at the end of a rainbow. He believes that through inheritance, through pressure, through sheer force of will, he will eventually own it. He sees you as a temporary obstacle, a gatekeeper who will one day fall. This ghost law, this community heritage trust, it doesn't just lock the gate, it removes the prize from the battlefield entirely. He picked up a pen and pointed to the highlighted section in the old ordinance book. Think about what this does, he said, his energy rising. The moment you sign the deed of trust, the ownership of 127 Maple Street transfers from Eli Coleman, private citizen, to the Westside Community Heritage Trust, a nonprofit entity. Your house ceases to be a private asset. It becomes a community resource as untouchable by developers as the public library or a city park. He paused to let that sink in. Your son-in-law can't inherit a public park, can he? He can't force a community center to sell its property for his own profit. His entire strategy, which is built on the foundation of future ownership, crumbles into dust. He's bringing an army to conquer a castle, and we're going to turn that castle into a cloud of smoke right before his eyes. The fog in my mind began to clear, replaced by a brilliant, dazzling light. It was a strategy of such beautiful, elegant simplicity. It wasn't an attack, it was a transcendence. I wasn't fighting Todd on his own greedy terms of money and ownership. I was moving the entire conflict to a higher ground, a place where his weapons were useless. A profound sense of peace began to settle over me. I looked at the box of Rose's research, and I knew with a certainty that resonated deep in my soul that this is what she would have wanted. Rose and I never saw this house as just ours. It was the hub of our community, a place for neighborhood barbecues, a safe haven for Amelia's friends. We built it to be a place of warmth and welcome. This trust wouldn't be a departure from that vision. It would be its ultimate fulfillment, making that spirit of community permanent and legally indestructible. So the house would belong to everyone, I said softly, more to myself than to Marcus. And therefore it could never belong to just one greedy man. That's it exactly, Marcus affirmed, his eyes shining. You've captured the poetry of it. It would be protected forever. Its story, your story, Rose's story, would be preserved. It could be used for after-school programs, for community meetings, for art classes. Its value would no longer be measured in dollars, but in the good it could do. He let me sit with the idea for a moment. I thought about the piano, the height marks on the door frame. They wouldn't just be my memories anymore. They would become part of the neighborhood's story, a testament to a time before the glass boxes and the high fences. There was, of course, a personal cost. I would no longer be the owner of my home. The deed would no longer bear my name. But what was ownership really? Todd's actions had tainted the very idea of it for me. He saw ownership as a right to exploit, to discard, to profit from. I now saw it as a responsibility, a stewardship. And this was my final act of stewardship for the home I had built and the woman I had loved. I would give it away to save it. I would release it to protect it forever. I looked Marcus squarely in the eye, the last of my doubts vanishing like morning mist. The path forward was clear. All right, I said, my voice firm and resolute. Let's do it. What's the first step? My decision to form the trust hung in the air between us, a solemn vow. But Marcus wasn't finished. The thrill of the hunt was still in his eyes. The discovery of the ghost law had been the key, but he knew from long experience that a single key doesn't always open every lock. A truly solid case, a fortress, is built from multiple layers of defense. He wasn't just looking for a shield, he was looking for a sword. This trust is our foundation, Eli, he said, tapping the ordinance book with a decisive finger. It's a stone wall. It protects the house itself. But a good general never just defends his position. He looks for a way to disrupt the enemy's supply lines. He turned his attention back to the box, to the chaotic collection of maps Rose had gathered. Let's look at the battlefield. He carefully lifted out the largest of the maps, a surveyor's plat of our block from 1968, 2 years before the city charter was rewritten. It was a beautiful, intricate document drawn with the kind of patient human precision that has been lost in the age of computers. The paper was thick as canvas, and the ink was a faded blue. It showed our neighborhood not as a collection of properties to be bought and sold, but as a community of homes, each with its generous patch of green earth. Look at this. Marcus set his finger tracing the familiar shapes of the houses. Look at how much space there was between us all. Room to breathe, room for gardens and kids to run. We spread the old map across his desk, its edges curling stubbornly. He then took a modern printed map from his wall, a stark clinical grid of property lines from the city's current database, and laid it next to the old one. The difference was heartbreaking. The new map was a cramped, crowded puzzle of subdivided lots and newly created parcels. It was a visual representation of the gentrification I had been watching from my window. "They've carved it up like a turkey," Marcus muttered, his disgust evident. His finger moved across the new map, tapping the large, consolidated lot behind my house, where the condo building was now rising from the ground. "This is Todd's project." Then his finger moved back to the old map. He traced the border of my own property, a familiar rectangle. But then he stopped. His finger hovered over a thin, almost invisible sliver of land running along the entire back edge of my property. On the old map, this sliver was clearly included within the blue ink lines of my lot. It was a narrow strip, maybe 10 feet wide, that connected to an old service lane at the end of the block. "What's this?" he asked, his voice low and focused. I leaned in closer. That's just the old alley," I said. "It hasn't been used in 50 years. It's all overgrown with weeds and bushes. The city trucks used it for trash pickup way back when." Marcus looked from the old map to the new one, then back again. On the new map, that sliver of land was gone, or rather it was no longer shown as part of my property. It was depicted as a neutral, unmarked space assumed to be a public right-of-way, a city-owned utility alley. "Eli," he said slowly, taking off his glasses. "When you put up the fence along your back garden, where did you put it?" "Right on the property line," I said confidently. "Or what I thought was the property line, at the edge of the manicured lawn just before the weeds of the old alley started." A slow, dangerous smile began to spread across Marcus's face. The same smile I had seen when he discovered the trust provision, but this time it held a sharper, more lethal edge. "He's arrogant," Marcus whispered as if talking to himself. "Your son-in-law. He's so arrogant and so sure of himself that he never did his due diligence. He relied on the new maps, the easy information. He never bothered to come down to the archives and pull the original county plat." He looked at me, his eyes gleaming with the light of a profound, game-changing revelation. "Eli, that alley isn't public land. It was never public land. According to this original, legally binding map, that 10-foot strip of overgrown weeds belongs to you." I stared at him, my mind racing to catch up. I tried to picture it. The back of my property, the fence, and the forgotten jungle of weeds behind it. I had always assumed it was city land. Everyone had. "But what does that mean?" I asked. Marcus let out a short, sharp laugh. It was the sound of a hunter who had just seen his prey walk directly into a perfectly laid trap. "What does it mean?" he repeated, his voice full of triumph. "It means everything. Think, Eli. How is a big condo building supposed to get its utilities? Water, sewage, electricity. How are the garbage trucks supposed to access the dumpsters? They can't run all of that through the front lobby. They need a service entrance. They need an easement. And the only logical place for that easement, the only direct path to the city's main service lines, is that forgotten little alley." The full catastrophic brilliance of it hit me like a physical blow. Todd's multi-million-dollar project, his entire vision depended on access to a tiny strip of land he thought was worthless public property. A strip of land that, in reality, belonged to the old man he was trying to discard. We didn't just have a shield anymore. We had a sword, and we were holding it right at the throat of his entire enterprise. A profound, electrifying silence filled Marcus's small office. It was the kind of quiet that follows a lightning strike when the world seems to hold its breath. The two discoveries, the two separate threads of hope, lay on the desk between us, and in that silence they began to weave themselves together into a single, unbreakable cord. It was a moment of perfect, terrifying clarity, the kind a mathematician must feel when a complex equation suddenly resolves into a simple, elegant answer. Marcus spoke first, his voice a low, awestruck whisper. "Do you see it, Eli? Do you see the beautiful, terrible perfection of this?" I could only nod, my own voice lost somewhere in my throat. I saw it. It was a strategy so flawless, so complete, it felt like it had been designed by the hands of fate itself. Rose's hands. The two pieces were not separate weapons. They were two parts of the same magnificent machine. "The trust," I said, finally finding my voice. "It protects the house. It puts a legal wall around it that Todd can never breach." "Exactly," Marcus affirmed, picking up the thread. "It's the perfect shield. It makes the house a non-profit, a community asset. He can't buy it, he can't inherit it, he can't touch it. His plan to move his parents in and eventually take over the property is dead on arrival. His campaign of attrition is over." He paused, a glint in his eye. "But that's just the defense. The alley," I continued, the pieces clicking together in my mind, "that's the offense. That's the sword." "It's more than a sword, Eli," Marcus corrected me, his voice rising with excitement. "It's a stranglehold. His entire multi-million-dollar condo project, his future, his investors' money, it all depends on access to that little 10-foot strip of weeds. Without it, he can't run his utilities. He can't get service vehicle access. His project is dead in the water. It's a financial catastrophe for him." The sheer scale of the leverage was staggering, but it was the next thought, the way the two pieces locked together, that truly took my breath away. "And when I deed the property to the trust," I began slowly looking at Marcus to see if he was following my train of thought. He was already there, a wide, triumphant grin spreading across his face. "I'm not just deeding the house," I finished. "I'm deeding the entire lot as described in this original plat map. I'm deeding the house and the alley." "Checkmate," Marcus said, the word landing on the desk with the finality of a gavel. "That's the masterstroke. That's the part he will never see coming. Once that alley becomes the legal property of the Westside Community Heritage Trust, his leverage disappears. He can't threaten you. He can't try to buy it from you. He can't pressure Amelia to convince you to sell. He would have to enter into a negotiation with the board of a nonprofit community organization." He let out a booming laugh. "And I can tell you right now, as the director of that organization, the board's asking price for that strip of land will be the complete and total cessation of his project and a public apology to the community he's trying to dismantle. In other words, the price is one he can never, ever pay." The plan was perfect. It was a beautiful, terrible, and utterly complete work of art. It didn't just protect me. It protected my neighbors. It didn't just save my house. It honored Rose's memory. And it didn't just stop Todd. It held him accountable for his arrogance, using the very laws of the city he sought to exploit as the instrument of his downfall. He thought he was playing a simple game against a tired old man. He had no idea he was playing against the ghost of a brilliant woman, the mind of a seasoned lawyer, and the entire legal history of the city of Atlanta. The plan was no longer just a vague idea. It was a clear three-step process. First, we would legally establish the trust. Second, we would file the deed transfer for the entire property, including the alley. And third, we would wait. We would let him walk into the trap with his arrogant smile and his moving truck, completely oblivious to the fact that the war was already over and he had already lost. The triumphant energy in the room, so potent just moments before, evaporated, replaced by the cold, sharp reality of the clock on the wall. Its ticking, once a gentle, rhythmic background noise, now sounded like a hammer, each tick a nail being driven into the coffin of my remaining time. It was past 8:30. Todd, with his smug smile and his moving truck, was scheduled to arrive at my front door in less than 90 minutes. Our perfect plan, our beautiful, intricate machine was useless if it remained just a theory on a desk. Marcus, as if reading my mind, underwent a complete transformation. The historian and the triumphant discoverer vanished. In his place stood a field commander on the eve of battle. His eyes, which had been warm with the thrill of the chase, became narrow and focused. His entire posture changed, becoming coiled and tense with purpose. "All right, Eli," he said, his voice stripped of all nostalgia. "The theory is sound. Now comes the execution. And it has to be flawless, and it has to be fast." He swept the old maps and ordnance books to one side of the desk, clearing a space with the swift, efficient movements of a surgeon preparing his operating table. He swiveled his chair to an old humming desktop computer, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "First, the Articles of Incorporation for the Westside Community Heritage Trust," he said, his fingers beginning to fly across the keys with a speed that defied his age. "We need a mission statement, something clear, powerful, and legally airtight. It needs to reflect your and Rose's intent." I watched the words appear on the screen, a formal legal structure rising from the ashes of my personal grief. We worked in a focused, rapid-fire rhythm. He would type a clause, then read it aloud, his voice sharp and questioning. Purpose: to preserve the architectural and cultural history of the Maple Street Historic District. Good enough. Yes, I'd reply, i.e., and to provide community-focused educational and recreational resources for its residents. Better, he'd say, and the clacking of the keys would resume. Every minute felt like an hour. Every tick of the clock was a drop of sweat on my brow. He pulled up legal templates, his old mind navigating the complex architecture of trust law with an instinctual grace. He was in his element, a master craftsman at his forge, hammering out my shield and my sword. Now the deed transfer, he said, pulling up a new document. Irrevocable. That's the key word. We have to make it legally impossible for anyone, including you, to ever reverse this. It was a sobering thought. I was about to perform an act of legal self-immolation, burning the bridge of ownership behind me forever. But as I watched him type my name, Eli Coleman, as the grantor and the name of our newly born trust as the grantee, I felt no fear, only a profound, liberating certainty. Suddenly, the phone on his desk buzzed, a harsh, intrusive sound that made us both jump. Marcus glanced at the caller ID. "It's Amelia," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "The final test." I took a deep breath. "Put her on speaker," I said. He pressed the button. "Hi, Dad." Amelia's voice filled the small office, sounding cheerful and utterly oblivious. "Just wanted to check in. We're all loaded up here. The moving truck is on its way. We should be there right at 10, maybe a few minutes early. Is that still okay?" Her words were like acid dissolving the last of my paternal illusions. She wasn't calling to see how I was. She was calling to confirm the logistics of my surrender. I looked at Marcus. He gave me a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "That's fine, honey," I said, and I was shocked by how calm and steady my own voice sounded. "I'll be here. Everything will be ready for your guests." "Oh, great," she said, a wave of relief in her voice. "I was so worried you were going to make this difficult. See you soon, Dad." She hung up. The silence she left behind was heavy with unspoken things. Difficult. She had no idea. Marcus looked at the clock. 9:15, he said grimly. That just lit a fire under us. The pace became frantic. We read through the final documents, our eyes scanning for any loophole, any ambiguous word that Todd's high-priced lawyers could exploit. Finally, Marcus hit print. The old laser printer in the corner whirred to life, spitting out the pages that held my future. They were still warm when Marcus gathered them, tapping them into a perfectly aligned stack. He placed them in a crisp, new manila folder. "Done," he said, his voice laced with exhaustion and triumph. "But we're not finished. This is just paper until it's signed, witnessed, and notarized. The county records office doesn't open until 9, but there's an all-night notary service 2 blocks from here. You need to go, now." He handed me the folder. It felt as heavy as a gravestone. "Get it notarized, Eli, then come straight home, and don't be a minute late for your 10 o'clock appointment." The drive from the community center was a blur. The familiar streets of my neighborhood seemed alien, transformed by the gravity of the mission I was on. The manila folder sat on the passenger seat beside me, a thin, unassuming object that contained the explosive power to level my son-in-law's entire world. It felt heavier than a bag of cement. My hands were steady on the steering wheel, but my heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. Every traffic light felt like a deliberate delay. Every slow-moving car, a personal obstacle in my race against the clock. 10 a.m. The deadline was a physical presence in the car with me, a silent, menacing passenger. My old flip phone, a device Todd had often mocked as a relic from the Stone Age, suddenly chirped from the center console. The screen lit up with Amelia's name. A part of me wanted to ignore it, to let it ring until it went silent, to focus only on the task at hand. But I knew that would only raise suspicion. I flipped it open, the plastic creaking, and pressed the green button. "Hello, Amelia," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "Dad, hi." Her voice was a performance of forced brightness, the kind of cheerful tone someone uses when they are trying to manage a situation, not have a conversation. I know I just called, but Todd had a thought, and I just wanted to touch base. I could hear the rustle of papers in the background, the low murmur of Todd's voice coaching her. She was not his wife in that moment. She was his mouthpiece. "We were just making a list of things for the movers. she continued, her voice losing some of its forced cheer and taking on a more businesslike, impatient edge. "And we just wanted to make absolutely sure. You have had a chance to clear out Mom's room, right? We'd hate for things to be awkward when his parents get there and their things have nowhere to go." The sheer, breathtaking callousness of it struck me like a physical blow. She wasn't asking about a room. She was asking if I had finished burying her mother for a second time. She was asking if I had completed the task of dismantling the last sanctuary of our shared history so that it could be conveniently occupied by strangers. All the pain, all the grief, all the anger of the last 24 hours coalesced into a single diamond-hard point of resolve in my chest. In that moment, any lingering shred of doubt, any last desperate hope that my daughter was merely a pawn in this game, evaporated. She was a willing participant. She was his co-conspirator. I took a slow, deliberate breath. I thought of the blueprints on Marcus's desk, of Rose's handwriting in the margins of the old city laws. I thought of the Community Heritage Trust, the legal entity that was at this very moment waiting to be born. My voice, when it came out, was as calm and placid as a deep, still lake. "Don't you worry about a thing, Amelia," I said. "I've been taking care of everything this morning." The lie was so smooth, so effortless, it surprised even me. "Oh, good," she said, the relief in her voice disgustingly palpable. "That's such a load off our minds. It's just been so hectic over here you wouldn't believe it." "I'm sure it has," I said, my voice still perfectly level. "You just focus on what you need to do. Everything here will be ready. Tell Todd his parents will be welcomed appropriately when they arrive." There was a double meaning in my words, a hidden layer of truth that she was completely blind to, and it gave me a cold, grim satisfaction. "You're the best dad," she chirped, the lie as easy for her as mine was for me. "We'll see you in a bit." She hung up. I didn't say goodbye. I just closed the phone, the snap of the plastic a sharp, definitive sound in the quiet car. The conversation, as painful as it was, had been a gift. It had severed the last thread of filial sentiment that might have made me hesitate. The daughter I was trying to protect, the little girl who learned to play piano in my living room, no longer existed. In her place was a stranger whose priorities were so warped she could no longer see the line between family and a financial opportunity. I looked up. I had arrived. A simple, unassuming sign in the window of a small storefront read, "24-hour notary public and legal services." I picked up the folder from the passenger seat. It no longer felt heavy. It felt like freedom. Inside the notary's office, the air was stale, smelling of old coffee and toner ink. It was a profoundly mundane place for such a monumental act. A tired-looking woman with glasses perched on the end of her nose glanced over the documents, her expression bored and impartial. She had no idea she was witnessing a declaration of war. She was just a functionary, a small but essential cog in the machine of the law. I signed my name where she indicated, my hand surprisingly steady. The signature was different from the one on the old deed. This was the signature of an old man, the lines a little shakier, but the intent behind it was harder than steel. She took the papers, pressed her official seal into the page with a satisfying percussive thud, and stamped it. The ink was a deep, definitive purple. It was done. The house was no longer mine. The trap was now legally, irrevocably set. As I drove away, the notarized documents secure in their folder, I imagined the conversation that was happening in Todd's expensive, leather-scented car. I could almost hear it, a phantom echo of the phone call I'd just had with my daughter. Amelia would have hung up and turned to Todd, a flicker of something, relief maybe, but also a sliver of confusion in her eyes. "He was fine," she would have said, almost as if she couldn't believe it herself. "He said everything is ready. He was so calm." And Todd, my son-in-law, would have smiled. Not a real smile, but that thin, self-satisfied smirk he wore when he believed he had outsmarted someone. "See, honey," he would have said, placing a condescending hand on her knee. "What did I tell you? He just needed a minute to process it. Old people can be stubborn, but they're not stupid. He knows he can't fight this. What's he going to do, hire a lawyer with his pension checks?" He would have laughed, a short, sharp bark devoid of any real humor. To Todd, the world was a simple equation of power and money, and in his mind I had neither. My calmness wasn't a warning sign to him. It was the white flag of surrender he had been expecting all along. But I knew my daughter. Beneath the layers of greed and the heavy influence of her husband, a sliver of the girl I raised still existed, and that sliver would be unsettled. I don't know, Todd. I could hear her saying, her voice a little hesitant. It just feels weird. He wasn't sad, he wasn't angry, he was just quiet. It was too easy. I expected him to yell to guilt trip me, but there was nothing. That was the part that would bother her. My lack of emotion, my failure to play the role of the wounded victim she had cast me in. My calm demeanor robbed her of the moral high ground she had tried to construct, the one where she was the long-suffering daughter making a tough but necessary decision for a difficult old man. Todd would have immediately moved to smooth over her doubts, to repaint the picture in the colors he wanted her to see. "Honey, he's doing it for you," he would have said, his voice dropping into that tone of feigned sincerity he used so well. "He knows this is important for our future, for the grandkids. He's putting his feelings aside because he loves you. He's finally accepting the reality of the situation. He would frame my surrender not as his victory, but as my final act of fatherly devotion." It was a brilliant manipulative move, absolving her of her guilt and reinforcing his control at the same time, and she would have accepted it. She would have nodded, wanting to believe it, because the alternative, that her father was not a victim but a quiet, calculating adversary, was too terrifying to contemplate. They would have continued their drive, their confidence restored, their narrative secure. They were the reasonable, forward-thinking children managing the affairs of a quiet, compliant old man who had finally accepted his place in their new world order. They were driving to their victory celebration. They were on their way to claim their prize. They saw my calm as the quiet of a placid lake after a storm has passed. They had no idea it was the calm of the deep ocean just before the Leviathan rises from the depths. While I was getting my signature notarized, sealing my own fate and theirs, Marcus was engaged in a different, more intricate battle. He wasn't waiting for me to return. The moment I walked out of his office, he had picked up the phone. Marcus was a creature of the old world, a world of handshakes, personal connections, and favors owed and paid. In an age where Todd communicated through texts and emails, Marcus waged war through the telephone. His first call was to a woman named Cynthia, a deputy clerk at the county records office. He had known her for 30 years, had helped her son get into a summer program back when he was a troubled teenager. "Cynthia, my dear, it's Marcus Vance," he would have said, his voice a warm, familiar melody. I know it's been too long. How's that handsome boy of yours? A doctor now. You see, I always told you he was brilliant." He would have spent exactly 2 minutes on pleasantries, a masterclass in the art of the personal touch. Then his voice would have dropped, becoming serious, urgent. "Cynthia, I'm in a bit of a bind. I have a time-sensitive filing, an emergency incorporation for a new nonprofit, and an immediate deed transfer. It's for an old friend, a good man, being backed into a corner by some very bad people. I know the queue for new filings is a week long, but I need this to be registered today, this morning, before 10 a.m. There would have been a pause, the sound of Cynthia's hesitation, the rustle of protocol. She would have explained the rules, the procedures, the impossibility of what he was asking. And Marcus would have just listened patiently. Then he would have said, his voice low and full of an old shared history. "Cynthia, do you remember that developer who tried to seize your mother's house on Elm Street back in '98? This is the same breed of wolf, my dear, and we're the only thing standing between him and an old man's legacy. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't a matter of justice." He would have let that hang in the air. Justice. It was a powerful word, a currency that still held value in the world Marcus inhabited. While I was driving back the notarized papers, a heavy weight on the seat beside me, Marcus was activating a network, a hidden web of old favors and long-standing relationships that crisscrossed the entire city government. His second call would have been to a man named David at the city planning department, the one department Todd would have assumed was in his pocket. "Dave, it's Marcus. Yeah, long time. Listen, I need you to do me a solid. Pull the original 1968 county plat for Block 12 Maple Street. No, not the digital one, the physical one from the archives. I have a suspicion someone has been playing fast and loose with the property lines on the new GIS maps. Yes, it involves that new condo development. The race was on. It was a battle fought not with shouts and threats, but with phone calls, with the quiet mobilization of decent people who still believed in doing the right thing. Marcus was a conductor orchestrating a symphony of bureaucratic defiance. He was asking the system, a system so often slow, impersonal, and frustrating, to move at the speed of a human crisis. He was asking it to have a conscience. As the minutes ticked relentlessly toward 10 o'clock, he would have been on the edge of his seat waiting for the return calls. The first would have come from Cynthia. "Okay, Marcus, she would have said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. I've put your file at the top of the stack. The trust is officially incorporated as of 9:45 a.m. The deed transfer is recorded. It's done. You owe me lunch. The second call would have been from Dave. You were right, Marcus, he would have said, a note of anger in his voice. The original plat is clear. That back alley is private property. It's always been private property. The GIS map is wrong. It looks like it was redrawn about 5 years ago to exclude that strip. Someone with a lot of influence must have pushed that through. The final pieces of the puzzle were locked in place. The trust was real. The ownership of the alley was confirmed. The fortress was built. The cannons were loaded, and the enemy was just now pulling up to the front gate, completely unaware that the war had already been lost. As I pulled my car into my driveway just a minute or two before 10, my phone rang. It was Marcus. I flipped it open. It's done, he said, his voice calm and steady. The West Side Community Heritage Trust is now the legal and rightful owner of 127 Maple Street and all adjoining property. Welcome home, Mr. Coleman. The office of the notary was a small airless room that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and dust. It was the kind of anonymous, forgettable place where profound life changes are made official every day, witnessed by strangers who are paid to be impartial. The woman behind the desk was the physical embodiment of that impartiality. Her face was a mask of professional boredom, her movements efficient and devoid of any curiosity. To her, I was just another client, and the stack of papers that represented the culmination of my life's work was just another file to be processed before lunch. She took the folder from me, her painted nails tapping impatiently on the cover. She scanned the documents, her eyes flicking over the carefully crafted legalese that Marcus had woven together. She saw the words Grantor Eli Coleman and Grantee the West Side Community Heritage Trust. She saw the legal description of the property, the cold, technical language that reduced my home to a set of coordinates on a map. She saw none of the history, none of the heart, none of the sacrifice. She saw only the lines that needed to be signed. She slid the final signature page across the desk and pushed a cheap plastic ballpoint pen towards me. Sign here and here, she said, her voice flat, and print your name here. I picked up the pen. It felt flimsy and insignificant in my hand. A pathetic instrument for such a monumental act. My eyes fell on the empty line next to my typed name. I thought of the last time I had signed a document this important. It was the original deed 40 years ago. I had signed it with a fountain pen, a gift from my father, and Rose had signed her name right next to mine, her beautiful looping script a perfect complement to my own blocky letters. That had been an act of creation, a signature of beginning, of possession of a future we were about to build together. This signature was the opposite. It was an act of release, of letting go, of ending my own story as the owner of 127 Maple Street. My hand did not tremble. The man who had sat in the dark the night before, consumed by grief and a sense of powerless rage, was gone. In his place was a man who knew his purpose with absolute clarity. This was not a surrender. It was a strategic masterstroke. I was not losing my home. I was making it immortal. I was placing it beyond the reach of greed, beyond the grasp of my own family, and enshrining it as a testament to the community Rose and I had loved. I was not being erased. I was being preserved. With a steady hand, I signed my name. The ink flowed onto the page, a dark, definitive line. It was the signature of a 75-year-old man, the letters not as strong or as fluid as they once were, but the intent behind them was more powerful than any signature I had ever made. I printed my name in the block letters as instructed. I pushed the paper back across the desk. I felt a pang, a sharp, sudden sense of loss that was almost physical. It was the feeling of a ship captain willingly cutting the rope to his own anchor, setting his vessel free on a vast, unknown sea. I was no longer the owner. The title was no longer mine. The house I had built with my own 2 hands no longer belonged to me. The notary glanced at the signature, gave a curt nod, and then reached for her stamp. She positioned it over the page, and with a heavy, percussive thud that seemed to echo in the small, quiet room, she pressed down. She lifted it, leaving a circle of crisp purple ink, an official seal that rendered the act final and irreversible. It was done. The trust was born. The property was transferred. The war, for all intents and purposes, was over. She gathered the papers, made a copy for me, and slid it into an envelope. "You're all set," she said, her voice already turned to the next client, the next file. I paid her the small fee, my hand moving as if in a dream. I took the envelope and walked out of the office back into the bright morning sun. I did not feel like a man who had just given away his most valuable possession. I felt lighter. The crushing weight of ownership of defending a legacy was gone. It had been replaced by a different, stronger feeling. I was no longer the owner of my home. I was its protector. And I was ready for the battle to begin. I arrived back at my house with 10 minutes to spare. The key felt different in my hand as I unlocked the front door. It no longer felt like the key to my kingdom, but the key to a fortress I had been entrusted to guard. The house itself felt different. The air was the same, the furniture was in the same place, but the ownership, the very soul of its legal identity, had been fundamentally altered. I was now a guest here, a custodian. The thought did not bring me sadness. It brought me a profound sense of peace. I had traded the burden of ownership for the honor of stewardship. I had just enough time to pour myself a glass of water and stand in the living room gathering my thoughts when I saw Marcus's old reliable sedan pull into the driveway. He got out not with the frantic energy of our morning meeting, but with a calm, deliberate gravitas. He carried a thin, elegant briefcase, a stark contrast to the bulging, chaotic one I had brought to him. His was the briefcase of an executioner, not an investigator. He let himself in without knocking, and we met in the center of the room, two old generals reviewing the final battle plan. He didn't waste a word on pleasantries. He opened his briefcase on the dining room table and laid out its contents. It was a small, neat stack of papers. They were printed on crisp, heavy bond paper, the kind that feels important in your hands. At the top of the first page was a beautifully designed letterhead that read, "The West Side Community Heritage Trust." Seeing the name in print, official and real, sent a shiver of pride down my spine. We had created something that would outlive us both. 2 envelopes. Marcus said, his voice low and precise, like a surgeon outlining a procedure. 2 distinct messages. He handed me the first set of documents. It was a letter 2 pages long. "This is the welcome note," he said, a grim smile playing on his lips. "It's for Gary and Brenda Miller. It's polite, professional, and absolutely devastating." I read the first paragraph. It began, "On behalf of the Board of Directors, I would like to formally welcome you to the neighborhood. We understand you are seeking long-term accommodation, and as the new owners and administrators of the property at 127 Maple Street, we are pleased to provide you with the enclosed application for tenancy should you wish to be considered." It was a masterpiece of legal cruelty cloaked in the language of bureaucratic politeness. It went on to explain the mission of the trust, the property's new designation as a community resource, and the formal application process, which included a background check and financial review. It never once mentioned Todd or Amelia. It treated the Millers as just another pair of prospective tenants. It was a document designed to induce a state of pure, bewildered shock. Then Marcus handed me the second set of papers and a different, more ominous-looking legal-sized envelope. "This one," he said, his voice turning cold, "is for your son-in-law. This one has no pretense of welcome." It was a packet of pure, unadulterated legal force. The top page was a formal cease-and-desist letter ordering Todd's company to immediately halt any and all preparatory work that involved trespassing on the trust's newly acquired property, specifically the 10-foot service alley. Behind it was a copy of the notarized, officially registered deed clearly showing the trust as the new owner. And behind that was a copy of the original 1968 county plat map with the service alley highlighted in a thick, unmissable yellow. It was a legal checkmate, a declaration that not only was the castle protected, but his entire supply line had been cut. With a slow, deliberate movement, I folded the documents. First, the welcome letter for the Millers. I slid it into a simple white business envelope, then the legal packet for Todd. I slid it into the long, formal envelope. Marcus had already addressed them in a neat block script, Mr. and Mrs. Gary Miller and Mr. Todd Miller. I sealed the flaps. The sound of the adhesive taking hold was quiet, but in the silent room it sounded as final as a cell door locking. I placed the 2 envelopes on the small table by the front door. My welcome gifts were ready. I looked at the clock on the mantel. It was exactly 10 a.m., and right on cue through the living room window, I saw the hulking shape of a large yellow moving truck turn the corner onto my street. The siege was about to begin. As evening fell, the house settled into its familiar rhythm of creaks and groans. The shadows grew long, stretching across the hardwood floors like silent, watchful fingers. But for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the silence was not my enemy. It was not the heavy, suffocating silence of grief and betrayal. It was a different kind of quiet. It was the deep, profound calm that comes after a momentous decision has been made, after a great weight has been lifted. I sat in my armchair, the one I had sat in every evening for 40 years, and I did not feel like a man who had just lost his home. I felt like a man who had finally come home to himself. The notarized copies of the trust documents and the deed transfer lay on the table beside me. I had read them over and over, not out of doubt, but out of a sense of wonder. The words on the page were a legal fiction, a construct of clauses and articles, but they had created a truth more real and more powerful than any brick or board in this house. The Westside Community Heritage Trust. It had a good, solid sound to it. It sounded like something that would last. It sounded like Rose. I thought about what Amelia and Todd were likely doing at this very moment. They would be at their own expensive dining table, perhaps raising a glass of wine to their cleverness, to their successful acquisition. They would be discussing logistics, finalizing the placement of their parents' furniture, debating which of my possessions should be the first to go to the donation bin. They would be brimming with the giddy, self-satisfied energy of people who believe they have won. There was no anger in the thought, no bitterness, only a deep, quiet, and profound pity. They were celebrating the capture of an empty castle. They were fighting over a treasure chest whose contents I had already spirited away to a place they could never reach. They were so busy measuring their victory in square footage and property values that they had become completely blind to the things that have real enduring weight. My eyes drifted to the piano. In the soft, fading light, its mahogany wood seemed to glow with a life of its own. Last night, looking at it had been an exercise in pain, a fresh stab of loss and betrayal. But tonight it was different. I could almost feel Rose's presence in the room, not as a sad, lingering ghost, but as a proud, approving partner. She had always been the strategist, the one who saw the long game. She would have loved this plan. She would have savored the beautiful, poetic justice of using the city's own history to protect a piece of it, of using the law, not as a weapon of greed, but as a shield of community, giving her home away to save it. That was exactly the kind of move she would have made. It was a move rooted not in anger, but in a fierce, protective love. I got up and walked over to the old instrument, my hand resting on its smooth, cool surface. I was no longer afraid of its silence. Its purpose was no longer just to hold the echoes of my private memories. Its future was to be filled with new music, perhaps the clumsy, joyful notes of another 6-year-old learning to play. The thought filled me not with a sense of loss, but with a sense of profound and unexpected joy. I was not the end of this house's story. I was just the bridge to its next chapter. I spent the rest of the evening in quiet contemplation, not as the owner of the house, but as its first custodian. I straightened a crooked picture frame in the hallway. I watered Rose's old fern, its green fronds, a stubborn splash of life in the quiet room. I made myself a simple supper of toast and tea and ate it at the kitchen table, the same table where I had received Todd's declaration of war less than 24 hours ago. It felt like a lifetime had passed since then. I was not the same man who had sat at this table last night. That man was a victim, a casualty, a man drowning in the past. Tonight I was a strategist, a protector, a man who had seized control of his own future by letting go of his possessions. The storm was coming. I knew that. Tomorrow morning the wind would howl, the rain would fall, and the full fury of Todd's entitled rage would break against this house. But it did not matter. I was not in the storm's path. I was in its eye, and I was ready for the morning. The truck arrived with a groan of protesting brakes and a loud hiss of air sounds that were as alien to my quiet street as a gunshot. It was enormous, a hulking yellow beast of a machine that blocked out the morning sun, casting a long, ominous shadow over my front lawn and the small garden Rose had so carefully tended. It parked directly in front of the walkway, its sheer size an act of arrogant dominance. It didn't just arrive, it occupied. It conquered. I stood by the living room window, partially concealed by the thin lace curtains, and watched the next phase of the invasion begin. A sleek, black luxury SUV, the kind that costs more than I made in 5 years of honest work, pulled up behind the truck. The driver's side door opened and Todd emerged. He didn't just get out of the car, he made an entrance. He adjusted the cuffs of his expensive-looking polo shirt, put on a pair of dark sunglasses that hid his eyes but not his intentions, and surveyed the scene. His lips were curled into that thin, self-satisfied smirk I had come to despise. It was the smirk of a man who had just closed a particularly profitable deal, the smirk of a predator who had successfully cornered his prey. He looked at my house, his head tilted back, not with the affection of a son-in-law looking at his family's home, but with the cold, appraising eye of a developer sizing up a property for demolition. He was a king surveying his newly conquered territory. The passenger doors of the SUV opened and his parents Gary and Brenda Miller stepped out. They were a perfectly matched set, both dressed in crisp beige linen, looking as if they were arriving for a garden party, not a move. Brenda's face was a carefully constructed mask of polite disdain. She looked at my house, her eyes scanning the simple wooden porch, the slightly faded paint on the window frames, and her lips tightened into a thin, disapproving line. She was not seeing a home filled with a lifetime of love. She was seeing a fixer-upper, a project that would require significant investment to bring it up to her standards. Gary was more overt. He clapped his hands together, a broad proprietary smile on his face. "Well, look at that," I could almost hear him saying. "It's got good bones." He looked at the old oak tree in my yard, not as a living thing, a silent witness to 40 years of my life, but as a mature landscape feature that would add to the property value. They were not looking at my home. They were conducting an inventory of their new asset. My daughter Amelia was the last to get out. She emerged from the back seat and she wouldn't look at the house. Her eyes were fixed on the ground, on her phone, on anything but the front door where her father was standing watching. She wore her guilt like a heavy, ill-fitting coat. She was a ghost at her own crime scene, her presence a silent, unwilling confession of her betrayal. Two burly men in matching uniforms got out of the moving truck and walked over to Todd, who started gesturing towards the house, pointing at windows, outlining his plan of attack. He was the general directing his troops. I watched all of this not with the hot rage of yesterday, but with a strange, almost detached sense of calm. It was like watching a play, a well-rehearsed tragedy, where I was the only one in the theater who knew the final shocking twist. They were all playing their parts so perfectly, so predictably. The arrogant son, the dismissive in-laws, the guilt-ridden daughter. They were so consumed by their own narrative of victory that they were completely blind to the reality of the situation. They saw an old man, a quiet house, and an easy conquest. They had no idea they were walking with their eyes wide open into a perfectly constructed legal ambush. I stepped back from the window, my heart a slow, steady drum in my chest. I walked to the small table by the front door and looked down at the two envelopes I had placed there. My welcome gifts. They looked so small, so harmless, just 2 pieces of paper. But I knew the truth. They were not paper. They were dynamite, and the fuse was about to be lit. I heard their footsteps on the porch, the sound of Todd's confident stride, the hesitant shuffle of Amelia's feet. I heard Todd's voice, loud and cheerful. "All right, let's get this show on the road." I heard the sound of the doorknob turning. The storm had arrived. The doorbell rang. It was a sharp, cheerful 2-note chime, a sound that had announced the arrival of friends of neighbors with borrowed lawnmowers of trick-or-treaters on Halloween night for 40 years. Today it sounded like a summons, the beginning of the end or the end of the beginning. I took one last deep breath, the air in the house feeling uniquely my own for the final time. I walked to the door, my footsteps steady on the floorboards I knew so well. I turned the cold brass knob and pulled the door open. They stood on my porch, a tableau of conquest. Todd was in the lead, his sunglasses pushed up on his head, that predatory smirk already in place. Behind him, his parents stood side by side, their expressions a mixture of impatience and entitlement. And behind them all, lagging a few steps, was Amelia. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed on the welcome mat at her feet as if she might find the answers to all her bad decisions written there in the woven fibers. She looked like a prisoner being led to her sentencing. Todd clapped his hands together, a loud, jarring sound that broke the morning quiet. "There he is," he boomed as if I were a long-lost friend and not a man he was actively displacing. He strode forward, crossing the threshold of my home without an invitation, and did something that made my blood run cold. He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture of forced, patronizing familiarity. It wasn't a friendly gesture. It was a gesture of ownership, the way a farmer might pat the flank of a prized bull he had just purchased at auction. "Welcome, Dad." He said the irony so thick it was almost suffocating. He was welcoming me to my own home. He stepped past me, his expensive cologne an invasive chemical scent in the familiar air of my house. He gestured around the living room with a grand, sweeping motion. "See, Dad, he said, his voice full of a false hearty enthusiasm. What did I tell you? It'll be cozy. A full house again. It'll be good for you. Cozy, the word was a desecration. Cozy was the feeling of Rose asleep beside me in the quiet of the night. Cozy was the warmth of the fireplace while Amelia did her homework at the kitchen table. Cozy was the feeling of safety and love and belonging that these people had systematically dismantled. To Todd, cozy meant managed, contained, and under his control. I said nothing. I just looked at him, my face a carefully constructed mask of neutral politeness. My silence seemed to unnerve him for a fraction of a second. He was expecting a reaction, anger, sadness, a plea, something to push against, to manage. My calm was a blank wall he couldn't find a foothold on. He quickly recovered, turning his attention to his parents. Come on in, Mom, Dad. Let's show you your new room. As Gary and Brenda Miller stepped inside, their eyes scanning everything with a critical, appraising gaze, my eyes found Amelia. She finally looked up, and for a fleeting, heartbreaking moment our gazes met. I saw it all in her eyes. The shame, the guilt, the desperate, unspoken plea for an understanding I could no longer give. She saw, I think, not the angry, wounded father she was expecting, but a stranger. A man who was calm, who was composed, and who was looking at her with a profound and unshakable disappointment that was far worse than any anger. She flinched as if I had physically struck her and quickly looked away, her face crumbling. They were all inside now. The invaders had breached the gates. They stood in the center of my living room, 4 people who were so caught up in their victory that they had forgotten the first rule of warfare: never underestimate your enemy. Todd was already directing the movers, who were now standing on my porch waiting for their orders. My moment had come. I cleared my throat, a small, quiet sound, but in the sudden lull it was as loud as a gunshot. All 4 of them turned to look at me. Before you get started, I said, my voice even and calm, I have something for you, a welcome gift. I turned and walked to the small table by the door, my back to them, and picked up the 2 envelopes. I turned from the table, the 2 envelopes in my hand. They felt as light as air, yet they held the weight of my entire future and the collapse of theirs. The 4 of them stood in a loose cluster in the center of my living room, a knot of impatience and entitlement. Todd was already looking past me, directing one of the movers who was hovering at the door. Okay, the big armchair can go against that wall for now, he was saying, already redecorating my life. I walked towards them, my steps measured and unhurried. I did not walk to Todd, the self-appointed general. I walked directly to his parents, the designated beneficiaries of this conquest. They looked at me with mild surprise, their conversation about where to put their antique grandfather clock momentarily interrupted. I held out the first envelope, the simple white one, to Brenda Miller. My hand was as steady as a surgeon's. A small, polite smile touched my lips. Mr. and Mrs. Miller, I said, my voice calm and welcoming. Before you go any further, I wanted to properly welcome you, not just to the house, but to the neighborhood. Brenda looked at the envelope, then at me, a flicker of confused annoyance in her eyes. She clearly viewed this as a quaint, time-wasting gesture from a sentimental old fool. She took the envelope from me with 2 perfectly manicured fingers, as if she were handling a slightly soiled object. Why, thank you, Eli, she said, her voice dripping with a condescending sweetness. How thoughtful, Gary chuckled, a booming, dismissive sound. What's this, Eli? He asked, clapping his hands together. The Wi-Fi password, a list of the best early bird specials in town. He winked at Todd, sharing a private joke at my expense. Todd, for his part, was simply impatient. He sighed, a dramatic put-upon sound. Dad, that's great, but we really need to get these guys started. Their time is my money. He didn't even look at me when he said it. I was just a background character in the story of his own brilliant success. Only Amelia seemed to understand that something was wrong. She stood frozen by the doorway, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes wide with a growing sense of dread. She knew me, and she knew that this quiet, polite version of her father was a far more dangerous man than the one who might have been shouting. Brenda, with an air of bored obligation, slid her long red fingernail under the flap of the envelope and tore it open. She pulled out the folded sheets of paper, a small indulgent smile on her face, expecting to see a greeting card with a picture of a flower on it. But her smile faltered as she unfolded the document. She saw not a greeting card, but a formal letter printed on heavy, official-looking paper. Her eyes scanned the top of the page, and the indulgent smile was instantly wiped from her face, replaced by a mask of pure, uncomprehending confusion. I knew what she was seeing. The elegant, unfamiliar letterhead, the West Side Community Heritage Trust. "What is this?" she murmured, her voice losing its sugary coating. Gary leaned over her shoulder, his own jovial expression evaporating as he read the first line. "On behalf of the Board of Directors, I would like to formally welcome you." His face, ruddy and full of life just moments before, began to pale. He snatched the letter from her hand, his eyes scanning the page with frantic, disbelieving speed. "Application for tenancy," he read aloud, his voice a hoarse whisper. "What in the hell is this, Eli? Is this some kind of sick joke?" His voice was loud, accusatory, but it was laced with the first unmistakable tremor of panic. The trap had been sprung, and the bait had been taken. Gary's booming laugh echoed in the living room, a sound of pure, unadulterated arrogance. "A sick joke, Eli. What have you been up to, you old rascal?" He was trying to frame it as a prank, a final feeble protest from a defeated old man. But his eyes betrayed him. They were wide with a confusion that was rapidly curdling into fear. The words on the page didn't align with the world as he knew it. Brenda snatched the letter back from him, her own face a mask of pinched, indignant fury. "This isn't funny, Eli," she snapped, her voice sharp and brittle. "What is the meaning of this board of directors, new owners and administrators? Are you senile?" Todd finally turned his full attention away from the movers. He had been observing the exchange with an air of detached amusement, but the genuine panic in his parents' voices had finally pierced his bubble of self-satisfaction. He strode over and plucked the letter from his mother's hand. All right, let's see what kind of nonsense he's cooked up," he said, his tone still laced with condescension. He held the letter up, and for a moment he just stared at the letterhead. His smirk, which had been a permanent fixture on his face, began to flicker. It wavered, then died completely like a faulty neon sign. He read the first few lines silently, his eyes scanning the page with a speed born of years of reading contracts. I watched his face. It was a fascinating, horrifying spectacle, like watching a statue crack in real time. The ruddy, confident complexion began to drain away, leaving a pale, waxy substitute. His jaw tightened, a small muscle twitching violently near his ear. His eyes, which had been so full of casual dominance, were now wide with a dawning, catastrophic understanding. He wasn't just confused like his parents. He was a real estate developer. He understood the language of ownership, of entities, of legal structures, and the words on that page were telling him a story that was, from his perspective, impossible. "What is this?" he finally said, his voice a low, strangled whisper that was nothing like his usual booming confidence. "West Side Community Heritage Trust. What the hell is that?" He looked at me, and for the first time since I had known him, he was looking at me not as an obstacle, but as a genuine, terrifying threat. His eyes were no longer hidden behind a mask of condescension. They were naked, and they were filled with a mixture of pure, unadulterated fury and the first chilling touch of fear. "It's exactly what it says it is, Todd," I replied, my voice still quiet, still calm. "It's a nonprofit organization, and as of 9:45 this morning, it is the legal and sole owner of this property." Gary and Brenda just stared, their faces blank canvases of shock. The words didn't compute. They were still trying to understand the rules of a game that had already ended. But Todd understood. Oh, he understood perfectly. His eyes flickered down the page, and I saw the exact moment he read the full name of the trust. I had asked Marcus to put it in the second paragraph. "The Coleman Rose Heritage Trust is dedicated to the preservation of..." I saw his eyes snag on that name. Coleman Rose. My name and my dead wife's name joined together into a legal entity, a shield he could not break. It was a personal blow, a message sent from beyond the grave, and it hit him with the force of a physical impact. His face, which had been pale, now went completely white. It was the color of bone. He looked as if he had seen a ghost. In a way, he had. He had come here to evict a memory, and instead that memory had risen up and evicted him from the future. "You can't do this," he hissed, the words barely audible, squeezed from a throat tight with rage. "This is my house, my inheritance." "No, Todd," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "It was never your house. It was my home, and now it belongs to the community. But please," I added, gesturing to the movers who were still standing awkwardly on the porch, "don't let me keep you. I believe your parents were expecting to move in." The cruel, polite hospitality of the words seemed to break the spell. Brenda let out a small, strangled gasp. Gary just stood there, his mouth slightly open, looking from the letter to my face and back again, his mind utterly broken by the impossible reality he was facing. And Amelia, my daughter, just leaned against the doorframe, her face as white as her husband's, tears finally beginning to stream silently down her cheeks. The welcome was complete. Todd, his face a mask of white-hot fury, finally found his voice. It was no longer the smooth, confident baritone of a man in charge, but a raw, ragged hiss. "Joke! You think this is a joke!" He crumpled the letter in his fist, the paper crackling in the stunned silence of the room. "You can't just invent some fake trust and pretend you've given away my house. That's not how the world works." "On the contrary, Todd," I said, my voice remaining level, a calm anchor in his storm of rage. "That is exactly how the world works. It's called contract law. It's called property law. You of all people should know that." I turned my gaze back to his parents, who were still staring at the mangled letter in their son's hand, as if it were a venomous snake. "Perhaps you should read the letter more carefully, Mr. Miller," I suggested to Gary. "It's all quite straightforward." The letter, as Marcus had so brilliantly designed it, was a masterpiece of polite bureaucratic language that delivered a series of devastating blows. It began with a simple, cordial welcome, the kind one might find in a brochure for a retirement community. It introduced the Coleman Rose Heritage Trust and identified it as the new legal administrator and title holder of the property effective as of that very morning. It explained in a brief and uplifting paragraph the Trust's mission to preserve the historical character of the community and to provide a space for educational and cultural enrichment for its residents. Every word was a subtle, carefully placed barb, a quiet celebration of the very values of community and history that Todd's entire business model was designed to destroy. The next section was the masterstroke, the part designed to dismantle their sense of entitlement brick by brick. It was titled Application Process for Prospective Residents. It explained that while the trust was not actively seeking tenants at this time, it was legally obligated to consider any serious application. It laid out the non-negotiable requirements for any individual wishing to reside on the property. First, a formal application, a copy of which was helpfully attached, had to be submitted to the Trust's Board of Directors for review. The letter noted that the review process could take up to 60 days. Second, prospective residents were required to submit to a full financial review, including 3 years of tax returns to ensure their ability to meet the community contribution fee, which would be set by the board. Third, a comprehensive background check was mandatory for all applicants. And fourth, 3 personal references were required, preferably from community leaders or long-standing residents of the neighborhood. The sheer humiliating audacity of it was breathtaking. These people who had arrived this morning as conquerors were now being told they would have to apply like common renters to a board of directors, and that their application would be judged on their character and financial stability. They would have to submit themselves to the scrutiny of the very community they held in such contempt. The final section of the letter detailed the community living bylaws. It explained that 127 Maple Street was no longer a private residence but a community asset. As such, any approved resident would be required to abide by a set of rules designed to ensure the property remained accessible and beneficial to all. These rules included limitations on noise restrictions, on altering the property's historical features, and a requirement that the main living areas be made available for scheduled community events, such as book clubs, tutoring sessions, or historical society meetings. The letter ended with a crisp, impersonal closing. "We thank you for your interest in the Coleman Rose Heritage Trust. Should you decide that our community living model does not suit your needs, we have taken the liberty of enclosing a list of several reputable local real estate agents who may be able to assist you in finding alternative accommodation. Sincerely, the Board of Directors." It was a final, devastating act of polite dismissal. It didn't just deny them the house. It offered to help them find the door, him. His bravado was a flimsy shield, and he was about to discover he had walked into a minefield. He tossed the cease and desist letter aside, a contemptuous flick of his wrist. "Meaningless," he spat. "You can't stop me from accessing my own property." But the next page stopped his tirade cold. It was a copy of the notarized deed of transfer. It wasn't a threat, it was a fact. It was a cold, hard legal reality stamped with the official purple seal of the county clerk's office. I watched his eyes dart across the page. I saw him read his own name not as the future owner, but as an irrelevant third party. I saw him read my name as the grantor, the man who had given it all away. And I saw him read the name of the grantee, the West Side Community Heritage Trust. The blood drained from his face, leaving a sickly grayish pallor. His jaw went slack. The swagger, the arrogance, the sheer suffocating confidence that was the core of his being evaporated in an instant. He looked up from the paper, his eyes wide with a horror that was beautiful to behold. He was no longer looking at a feeble old man. He was looking at a ghost who had just rewritten the future. He was a real estate developer. He understood what he was holding. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a fantasy. This was a recorded, legally binding transaction. The house was gone. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was a fish on the deck of a boat gasping for the water he had always taken for granted. But I wasn't finished. There was one more page. The final nail. The one that would seal his professional coffin. Beneath the deed was the copy of the 1968 County Plat map. The old elegant lines stood in stark contrast to the modern sterile legal documents. And there, highlighted in a thick, unmissable, almost fluorescent yellow, was the 10-foot strip of land running along the back of my property, the forgotten alley. An arrow drawn in Marcus's neat, steady hand pointed to it with a simple, devastating annotation, property of the West Side Community Heritage Trust. Todd stared at the map. At first there was only confusion. It was an old, irrelevant document to him, but then a flicker of recognition. I could see the gears turning in his developer's mind, the frantic calculations, the desperate search for an alternate route. I could see him picturing the blueprints for his condo building, the plans for the utility lines, the access route for the service vehicles. And I could see the precise, catastrophic moment that the two images, the old map and his new project, collided in his brain. The alley, his entire project, his investors' money, his reputation, it all depended on that little strip of yellow. A strip of land he now knew he could never have. A strip of land that now belonged to a non-profit organization run by a man who despised everything he stood for. He finally understood. This wasn't just about the house. I hadn't just protected my home. I had taken a metaphorical stick of dynamite and shoved it into the foundations of his entire career. The white of his face was now tinged with a shade of green. His breathing was shallow, ragged. He looked from the map to my face, and the look in his eyes was something I will carry with me to my grave. It was the look of a god who had just been informed that he was in fact mortal. He had been so utterly, so completely, and so beautifully outplayed. He let the papers slip from his numb fingers. They fluttered to the floor, the deed, the map, the letter landing in a messy pile at his feet. They were the wreckage of his future. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by a small, choked sob from Amelia. Todd just stood there, swaying slightly, his mind shattered. The silence stretched for a beat, 2 beats, and then something inside him snapped. A guttural, animalistic sound of pure rage tore from his throat. "No!" he screamed, the sound exploding in the quiet house, a primal roar of a king who had just lost his kingdom. "This is a joke. This has to be a joke." Todd's scream tore through the quiet dignity of my home, a raw, ragged sound of pure, unadulterated rage. It was the sound of a king being dethroned, of a god discovering his own mortality. The carefully constructed facade of the smooth, confident real estate developer shattered into a million pieces, revealing the spoiled, entitled child that had always lurked beneath. "This is a joke!" he bellowed. His face contorted into a mask of crimson fury. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his whole body shaking. You old fool! What have you done? You can't do this. This is illegal. I'll have you arrested." His words were a chaotic spray of accusations, a desperate attempt to reshape a reality that had become a nightmare for him. He was like a drowning man thrashing wildly at the water that was consuming him. His mother, Brenda, finally snapped out of her shocked stupor and rushed to his side, her own face a mirror of his indignant rage. "He's right, Todd," she shrieked, her voice a shrill, piercing sound. "This is elder abuse. He's clearly not in his right mind. We'll get a lawyer. We'll have him declared incompetent. This house is ours." Gary, his face still pale, nodded in vehement agreement. "That's right. This is fraud. A conspiracy," he blustered, his voice regaining some of its volume but none of its former authority. They were a chorus of denial, a family united in their shared delusion that the world must bend to their will. They couldn't conceive of a reality where they had been so thoroughly and completely outmaneuvered. I stood my ground. I did not raise my voice. I did not engage in their hysteria. I let their accusations wash over me, a tidal wave of impotent fury breaking against the stone wall of my calm. There is nothing illegal about what I have done. I said, my voice quiet but carrying a weight that cut through their noise. I have made a legal and binding decision regarding my own property. Or rather, I corrected myself, allowing a small cold smile to touch my lips. What was my property? My calm was gasoline on the fire of his rage. "I'll sue you into the ground," he roared, taking a step towards me, his fists clenched at his sides. "I'll sue this ridiculous fake trust. I'll have my lawyers crawl over every inch of this sham until you have nothing left. You are welcome to try," I said, my voice still even. "But your lawyers will find that the Westside Community Heritage Trust is a legally incorporated nonprofit entity registered with the state of Georgia this morning. They will find that the deed transfer is recorded and validated by the county. And they will find that the original plat map from 1968 is the legally recognized document of record for this property. They will find, in short, that you have no case." Every word I spoke, every calm factual statement was another blow, another turn of the screw. He was a man who was used to winning arguments through intimidation, through the sheer force of his personality and the weight of his money. He had no defense against the quiet, unshakable power of the truth. He looked around the room, his eyes wild, searching for a weapon, for some leverage he could use. He looked at his parents, at the movers, who were now staring with open mouths from the porch, and then his eyes fell on Amelia. "Amelia," he snapped, his voice a vicious, desperate command. Tell your father to stop this insanity. Tell him to undo it right now." All eyes turned to my daughter. She stood frozen against the doorframe, her face a mess of tears and mascara. She was trapped, a deer caught in the blinding headlights of a future she had helped create. She looked from her husband's furious, demanding face to my own quiet, resolute one. She opened her mouth, but only a small, broken sob escaped. She shook her head, not in defiance of him, but in a gesture of complete and utter despair. She had no words. She had no power here. She was a ghost, a silent witness to the destruction she had co-authored. Her silence was the final confirmation of his defeat. He saw it. In that moment, he saw that he had lost her too. The rage in his eyes flickered, replaced for a fraction of a second by a look of pure animal panic. He had lost everything. The house, the deal, his wife's unquestioning loyalty. It was all gone. And it had all been taken from him by the one man in the world he had never for 1 second considered a threat. Just as Todd's rage reached a fever pitch, a new voice, calm and steady as a riverstone, cut through the chaos. "Everything is perfectly legal, Mr. Miller." The voice came from the doorway to the kitchen, a place they had all forgotten in their hysteria. And standing there was Marcus Vance. He hadn't been there a moment ago. It was as if the sheer force of their injustice had summoned him into existence. He was not an imposing figure. He was an old man just like me, dressed in a simple cardigan and slacks. But he carried himself with an unshakable, quiet authority that immediately sucked the oxygen out of Todd's firestorm. In his hand, he held a worn, leather-bound legal file, and he held it with the casual confidence of a master swordsman holding his blade. Todd, momentarily stunned by the sudden appearance of a stranger, spun around to face him. His face was still contorted with rage. "And who the hell are you?" he snarled, immediately dismissing Marcus as another irrelevant old man, an insignificant detail in his grand drama. "My name is Marcus Vance," he said, his voice calm and even. He took a slow, deliberate step into the living room. He did not look intimidated. He looked like a librarian who had come to quiet a group of unruly children. "I am the director of the Westside Community Center. I am also the chairman of the board for the newly incorporated Coleman Rose Heritage Trust. And," he added, his eyes locking with Todd's, "I am Mr. Coleman's legal counsel." The words legal counsel hung in the air, heavy and cold. Todd actually recoiled, as if the words themselves were a physical blow. He had been operating on the assumption that I was alone, that I was an isolated old man with no resources. The appearance of a calm, articulate lawyer in a cardigan was a variable he had not accounted for, and it threw his entire tirade off balance. "This is a sham," Todd blustered, trying to regain his footing. "You can't just invent a trust overnight. This is fraud. I'll have you both disbarred." Marcus didn't even blink. He walked over to his dining room table and opened his file. "On the contrary, Mr. Miller," he said, his voice as patient as a professor's, "everything has been handled with meticulous attention to the law." He began to lay out documents on the table, not copies but the original primary source documents, each one a nail in the coffin of Todd's future. "This," he said, placing the articles of incorporation on the table, "is the certificate of incorporation for the trust filed with and approved by the Secretary of State for Georgia. You'll note the official seal." He then laid down the notarized deed of transfer. "This is the legally recorded deed filed with the county clerk's office this morning, transferring full and irrevocable title of this property to the trust. You'll note the timestamp." Finally, he unrolled the original heavy paper of the 1968 county plat map, its faded blue lines a stark contrast to the modern legal forms. "And this," he said, his finger tapping the highlighted alley, "is the official plat map of record for this block, confirming that the service alley behind this property is and always has been private land belonging to this lot." He looked up from the documents, his gaze pinning Todd to the spot. "Your own due diligence should have revealed that last fact, Mr. Miller. It's a rather catastrophic oversight for a developer of your supposed caliber. The insult was delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. It wasn't just an attack, it was a professional execution." Todd stared at the documents on the table. The official seals, the timestamps, the original undeniable map. It was an irrefutable wall of fact. His fury, which had been so loud and explosive, finally burned out, leaving nothing but the cold gray ash of defeat. His shoulders slumped. The fight went out of his eyes, replaced by a hollow, empty look. He had been beaten not by shouting, not by threats, but by quiet competence, by diligent research, and by the ghost of an old law he had been too arrogant to even look for. He was a bully who had just run into a man he couldn't intimidate, armed with a truth he couldn't deny. Marcus straightened the papers into a neat pile. "So you see," he concluded, his voice soft but final, "Mr. Coleman has not done anything illegal. He has simply exercised his rights. Everything is in order, and there is absolutely nothing you can do about it." Marcus did not raise his voice. He didn't have to. His authority was not in his volume, but in his absolute command of the facts. He addressed Todd, but he spoke for the benefit of everyone in the room, laying out the architecture of their defeat with the calm, methodical precision of a master builder. "Let's be perfectly clear, Mr. Miller, so there are no further misunderstandings." He began, his voice patient, as if explaining a simple concept to a difficult child. "First, regarding the trust, it is not a sham. The Coleman Rose Heritage Trust is a legally recognized 501c3 nonprofit organization incorporated under the laws of the state of Georgia. Its articles of incorporation were filed and approved this morning. It has a board of directors, a state admission, and a legal standing that is, I assure you, impeccable." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. He then picked up the notarized deed. "Second, regarding the property. At 9:45 a.m., Mr. Coleman, as was his legal right, signed an irrevocable deed of transfer gifting this property in its entirety to that trust. That deed was witnessed, notarized, and electronically filed with the Fulton County Clerk's office. It is a done deal. As of this moment, this house and the land it sits on do not belong to Eli Coleman. They belong to the trust. Therefore, any future claim you believe you have through inheritance is legally null and void. You cannot inherit what no longer belongs to the estate." Todd's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The legal finality of it was a cage, and the bars were closing in around him. But Marcus was not finished. He saved the most devastating blow for last. He gestured to the old yellowed map. "And finally," he said, his voice dropping slightly, becoming even more precise, "there is the matter of the service alley. I know you are aware of it, Mr. Miller. Your own site plans for the condominium project rely on using that alley for utility access and service vehicle entry. Your entire project, in fact, is not viable without it." He looked Todd directly in the eye. "Your catastrophic error was in assuming that alley was public land. It is not. As this original legally binding plat map from 1968 confirms that 10-foot strip of land is and always has been part of this private lot, which means that as of 9:45 a.m. this morning, that alley also belongs to the trust." The final piece clicked into place. I watched the full, horrifying scope of the disaster dawn on Todd's face. It was like watching a building be demolished in slow motion, not with a wrecking ball, but from the inside out. He had not just lost a house he intended to flip. He had lost the key that unlocked his entire multi-million-dollar project. The furious red of his face drained away, leaving a clammy gray pallor. His eyes, which had been blazing with fury, became unfocused. They were the eyes of a man doing a frantic, impossible calculation in his head. He was adding up the cost of the land, the investor's capital, the penalty clauses in his contracts, the bank loans, and arriving at a sum that spelled absolute ruin. He had built a house of cards on a foundation of arrogance and greed, and Marcus had just calmly, legally, and completely pulled the bottom card out. He understood now that he couldn't bully a non-profit organization. He couldn't pressure a board of directors whose stated mission was the exact opposite of his own. He was trapped. The house was gone. The alley was gone. The project was dead. The money was gone. Gary's blustering face had gone slack with the dawning horror of his own financial entanglement in his son's failure. Brenda's hand was at her throat, her face a mask of disbelief. And Todd just stood there, a hollowed-out man, the ghost of the Titan he had believed himself to be just 10 minutes ago. He was finally utterly and blessedly silent. Amidst the wreckage of her husband's ambition, Amelia remained a statue of silent grief. She stood pressed against the doorframe as if it were the only thing holding her upright, her arms wrapped tightly around her waist in a desperate, futile attempt to hold herself together. Her face stained with silent tears was a canvas of dawning horror. She was not just watching a real estate deal go bad. She was watching her entire life, the life she had chosen, the man she had married, the daughter she had become, crumble into dust before her very eyes. Up until this morning, she had lived within a carefully constructed narrative, a story told to her by her husband. In this story, they were the heroes, a smart, ambitious young couple building a future. I was a supporting character, the aging, sentimental father who needed to be managed, whose assets needed to be optimized for the good of the family. It was a story that allowed her to justify her actions, to silence the nagging voice of her conscience. But that story was now in ashes. The hero of her story had been revealed to be a screaming, entitled bully, a man whose power was as hollow as his promises. She looked at Todd, truly looked at him, and she did not see the charming, successful provider she thought she had married. She saw a stranger, a furious child throwing a tantrum because his favorite toy had been taken away. Then she looked at me, and she did not see the passive, compliant old man she had planned to manage. She saw the father who had taught her to ride a bike, the man who had stayed up all night helping her with her science projects. She saw a man of quiet, unshakable dignity, a man of strategic brilliance who had just single-handedly defended his legacy against an attack she had helped to plan. She was seeing us both clearly for the first time, stripped of all the lies and self-deception, and the truth was a blinding, painful light. But the most devastating realization was not what she saw in us, but what she saw in herself. She was not an innocent bystander. She was a co-conspirator. Every lie she had told herself, every time she had dismissed my concerns, every phone call she had made on Todd's behalf, it all came rushing back to her, not as a series of small, necessary compromises, but as a chain of profound betrayals. She had chosen this path. She had traded the solid, unconditional love of her father for the transactional, conditional affection of her husband. She had sold her birthright for a mess of pottage, and she had just discovered that the pot was empty. Todd, in his final, desperate throes of defeat, turned on her. His rage, having found no purchase on the stone walls of Marcus's legal facts or my quiet resolve, needed a new target. And she was the closest and the weakest. "You," he snarled, his voice a venomous whip. "This is your fault. You were supposed to handle him. You told me he would be reasonable. You couldn't even control your own senile father." The cruelty of his words was breathtaking. He wasn't just blaming her, he was trying to transfer his own humiliation onto her to make her the scapegoat for his own catastrophic failure. I saw her flinch as if he had slapped her. Her head bowed and a new wave of sobs shook her small frame. But she did not answer him. She did not defend herself. She did not rush to his side to try and soothe his wounded ego. She just stood there, absorbing the full, ugly truth of the man she had married. Her silence, which had once been the silence of complicity, was now the silence of judgment. It was a final, devastating verdict on him, on them, on the life they had built together. In that moment, something broke between them, something that could never be repaired. He had lost the house, he had lost his project, and now in this final desperate act of cruelty, he had lost his wife. She lifted her head, her tear-streaked face no longer a mask of confusion, but of a terrible newfound clarity. She looked at me, her eyes full of a grief so profound it was almost unbearable to witness. And in that look I saw the ghost of the little girl I had raised finally tragically waking up. Amelia's silence was the final devastating blow. It was the one variable Todd hadn't accounted for, the one betrayal he couldn't comprehend. His rage, which had been a wild, roaring inferno, suddenly had nowhere to go. It turned inward, consuming what little was left of his composure. The shock that had paralyzed him moments before gave way to a second, more pathetic wave of fury. This was not the intimidating rage of a powerful man. It was the impotent, flailing tantrum of a cornered animal. "I'll fight this," he sputtered, his voice cracking. He stabbed a finger at the documents on the table, then at Marcus, then at me. "I'll get the best lawyers in Atlanta. I'll tie you up in court for the rest of your miserable life. This house will rot before you ever see a single child in here for a book club." The threats were grand, but they landed with no force. They were the desperate bluffs of a gambler who had just lost his entire stack. He was trying to conjure the ghost of his former power, but the spell was broken. Marcus simply shook his head, a look of profound pity in his eyes. "You can certainly try, Mr. Miller," he said, his voice calm and almost gentle. "You can spend a fortune of your investors' money on legal fees. Your lawyers will file motions. We will file counter motions. It will take years. But in the end, the law is the law, the trust is valid, the deed is recorded, the map is a historical fact. You will lose. The only question is how much money you'll waste before you accept that." Every calm, reasonable word from Marcus was like a fresh log thrown onto Todd's fire. He was used to people cowering when he raised his voice. He was used to his anger being a tool that got him what he wanted. Our refusal to be intimidated, our quiet certainty, was a reality his ego could not process. It was like he was punching a brick wall and couldn't understand why the wall wasn't falling down. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" He sneered at me, his face turning a blotchy, unhealthy red. "You with your dusty old house and your dusty old friend. You think you've won?" "There is no winning or losing here, Todd," I said. And for the first time I felt a stirring of something other than anger or resolve. It was a deep, aching sadness for him, for my daughter, for the wreckage they had made of their lives. "This is simply the consequence of your own actions. You saw this house as a thing to be taken. You never saw it as a home to be cherished. That was your mistake." My pity was to him the ultimate insult. He let out a strangled, frustrated scream. He looked around the room, his eyes wild, searching for something to break, for some way to physically manifest the impotent rage that was consuming him. He took a step towards the piano, his hands clenched into fists, and for a terrifying second, I thought he was going to smash his hand down on the keys to scar the one thing in this house that was most precious to me. But he stopped. Even in his rage, some primal instinct for self-preservation must have warned him against it. He knew that if he crossed that line, there would be no coming back. Defeated, he spun around, his grand, intimidating presence shrunk and diminished. He was no longer the conqueror. He was just a man in a room, a man who had been so thoroughly, so completely, so elegantly beaten that there was nothing left for him to do. The movers on the porch, who had been watching the entire drama unfold with wide, unblinking eyes, began to slowly, quietly back away from the door, as if not wanting to be associated with the spectacular implosion they had just witnessed. Todd was alone, trapped in the wreckage of his own making, his impotent fury a useless, sputtering engine that had finally run out of fuel. The final echoing scream of Todd's impotent rage hung in the air, then died, leaving a vacuum of profound, awkward silence. The battle was over. The smoke had cleared, and the victors and the vanquished were left to survey the ruins. Todd stood in the center of the room, a statue of defeat. The fury had drained out of him, leaving behind a hollow, broken man. His shoulders were slumped, his hands hung limp at his sides, and his eyes, which had been blazing with fury just moments before, were now dull and empty. He looked like a man who had just run a marathon, only to be told he had been running in the wrong direction. It was Brenda who broke the spell. Her shrill, indignant voice, which had been a weapon just moments ago, was now thin and reedy, laced with a tremor of pure panic. "Well," she said, turning on her son, her voice a desperate pleading whine. "Todd, what are we going to do? Where are we supposed to go? The movers are here. All of our things are in that truck." Her words, meant to spur him to action, only highlighted the totality of their defeat. The moving truck, which had been a symbol of their impending victory, was now a monument to their homelessness. Their beautifully orchestrated plan had left them with a truck full of furniture and absolutely nowhere to put it. Todd didn't answer her. He couldn't. He had no plan B. The possibility of failure had never even entered his arrogant mind. Gary, seeing his son's catatonic state, tried to step in to reassert some semblance of patriarchal control. Now, Brenda," he blustered, though his voice lacked any real conviction. "Let's all just calm down. We'll call our lawyer. We'll get this sorted out." But even as he said the words, he knew they were empty. He had seen the documents. He had seen the look on his son's face. He knew with a dawning, sickening certainty that there was nothing to sort out. The head mover, a large, patient man who had been watching the entire soap opera unfold from the porch with a look of stoic professionalism, finally chose his moment. He stepped forward holding a clipboard. He didn't look at me or Marcus. He looked directly at Todd, the man who had hired him, the man who was supposed to be in charge. "Sir," he said, his voice a respectful but firm rumble, "my crew is on the clock. What are your instructions? Are we unloading here, or are we going to another location?" The simple, practical question was the cruelest blow of all. It forced Todd to confront the logistical nightmare he had created. He had a truck, a crew, and a mountain of furniture, and he was standing on the porch of a house that was no longer his. Todd stared at the mover, his empty eyes slowly regaining a flicker of focus. He looked at his parents' panicked faces. He looked at Amelia's tear-streaked, silent judgment. He looked at me standing tall and quiet in the home he had tried to steal. And something inside him finally irrevocably broke. He didn't shout. He didn't make another threat. He just seemed to deflate, to shrink in on himself. He turned not to the mover but to his father. "Get Mom in the car," he said, his voice a hoarse, defeated whisper. "Just get her in the car." It was not an order. It was a plea. It was the sound of a general ordering a full, unconditional retreat. The departure was a mirror image of their arrival, but stripped of all its triumphant arrogance. It was a slow, shuffling, humiliating exodus. Gary, his face a mask of grim resignation, gently took his wife's arm. She tried to pull away to utter one last shrill protest, but the fight was gone from her too. He led her down the walkway, past the movers, past the hulking yellow truck, a silent, defeated queen being led from her conquered castle. Todd turned to the head mover. He couldn't look the man in the eye. He stared at a point somewhere over the man's shoulder. "Take it all to your storage facility," he said, the words costing him a visible effort. "I'll call the office on Monday to sort it out." The mover just nodded, a flicker of pity in his eyes. He made a quiet signal to his crew, and they began to slowly, respectfully retreat to their truck. Finally, Todd looked at Amelia. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say. He just gave a slight, almost imperceptible jerk of his head towards the car, a silent command. She didn't move for a moment, her eyes locked with mine. Then she turned, her shoulders slumped, and walked away from me, away from the house, away from the life we once had, and got into the back seat of her husband's car. Todd was the last to leave. He stood on the walkway for a moment, the wreckage of his ambition all around him. He gave me one last look, a look of pure, unadulterated hatred, a look that promised a lifetime of resentment. Then he turned and walked away. I watched them get into their expensive black SUV. I watched it pull away from the curb. And then with a final protesting hiss of its air brakes, the big yellow moving truck, which had arrived with such promise of a new beginning, rumbled to life and followed them down the street, its cargo bay full of furniture that had no home. And then there was silence. The beautiful, peaceful, and blessedly silent sound of victory. The silence they left behind was a physical thing. It was heavier than the noisy chaos of their arrival, filled with the ghosts of shouts and the residue of shattered relationships. The big yellow truck was gone. The sleek black SUV was gone. The street was quiet again, as if a violent, localized storm had passed as quickly as it had arrived. Marcus and I stood in the living room, two old soldiers on a silent battlefield. He walked over and picked up the documents Todd had thrown to the floor, straightening the crumpled pages with a gentle hand. He placed them neatly back in his file. He looked at me, his eyes full of a deep, quiet understanding. "Well, Eli," he said softly, "the house is safe." He put a hand on my shoulder, a gesture of solidarity, of a shared and difficult victory. "I'll handle the follow-up with their lawyers if and when they call. You just rest." He knew without me having to say a word that this was not a moment for celebration. He knew the cost of this victory. He gave my shoulder a final firm squeeze and walked to the door. "I'll let myself out," he said. He closed the door quietly behind him, leaving me alone with the wreckage. I thought he had left me completely alone, but a small broken sound from the doorway told me otherwise. Amelia. I had forgotten she was still there. She hadn't left with them. She stood exactly where she had been for the last 10 minutes, pressed against the doorframe as if she were trying to merge with the wood. Her face was a pale, tear-streaked ruin. Her body was racked with silent, shuddering sobs. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen, and they were filled with a confusion so profound it was like looking at a lost child. She finally pushed herself away from the door and took a hesitant, shuffling step towards me. Then another. She stopped a few feet away, her hands twisting together a knot of pure misery. "Dad," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. "Why?" The question was so simple, so naive, it almost broke my heart all over again. She was asking me. After everything that had happened, after all the lies, after the blatant, calculated cruelty, she was still looking to me to explain the world to her, to make it make sense. She was asking why I had defended myself, not why she had attacked me. I looked at my daughter, the woman who had been a stranger to me for years, and was now a stranger to herself. I felt a wave of pity so deep it was almost painful. "That's the wrong question, Amelia," I said, my voice gentle but unyielding. "And you're asking the wrong person." She just stared at me, her brow furrowed in confusion. "The question isn't, why did I do this?" I continued, my voice gaining a quiet strength. "The question is, why did you do this? Why did you stand by and let your husband treat your father with such contempt? Why did you agree to a plan that involved erasing your own mother's memory from this house? Why was a business deal more important than your own family? Those are the questions that need answers, honey, and I don't have them. Only you do." The truth of my words seemed to land on her with a physical weight. Her shoulders slumped. "I didn't..." She began, the old familiar excuses already forming on her lips. "I didn't understand. He told me... I thought..." "You thought what?" I asked, my voice still soft but with a new edge of steel. "Did you think I wouldn't fight back? Did you think I would just quietly fade away? Did you think that the man who raised you, who taught you right from wrong, would simply allow this to happen?" I gestured around the quiet room. "This isn't just wood and plaster, Amelia. This is your mother's piano. These are your height marks on the wall. This is your history, and you were willing to sell it all. For what? For a bigger house? For a membership at a country club?" She finally broke. A raw, guttural sob tore from her throat, and she covered her face with her hands. "I'm sorry." She wept, the words muffled by her fingers. "Daddy, I'm so sorry." The sound of her calling me Daddy for the first time in years was a knife in my heart, but the wound was too deep. An apology was a bandage on a severed limb. "I know you are," I said, and I meant it. "But sorry doesn't change what you did. It doesn't unring the bell." She looked up, her face full of a desperate, pleading hope. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice a child's whisper. "How do we fix this?" I shook my head slowly. "There is no we right now, Amelia," I said, and the words were the hardest I had ever had to speak. "There is only you. You have to go. You have to leave this house, and you have to figure out who you are without your husband telling you, and without me to fall back on. You have to find your own foundation." She just stared at me, the final, terrible understanding dawning in her eyes. I had not just taken back my house, I was closing a door she had never imagined would be closed to her. And for the first time in her adult life, my daughter was truly, completely on her own. Amelia's question, "How do we fix this?" hung in the air between us, a fragile, desperate prayer. She was looking for a magic wand, a simple solution that would rewind time and erase the ugly events of the past 24 hours. She wanted me to provide the answer, to tell her the secret words that would make everything right again, just as I had when she was a little girl with a scraped knee or a broken toy. But this was not a scraped knee. This was a self-inflicted wound, deep and festering, and I did not have the cure. I took a step towards her, and for a moment I think she expected me to embrace her, to pull her into a hug and tell her it would all be okay. But I stopped, keeping a small but significant distance between us. I had to. The boundary had to be drawn, not just with words, but with actions. "Honey," I began, and the word itself was an ache in my chest, a memory of 1,000 bedtime stories and father-daughter dances. "You're still thinking of this as a problem that can be fixed like a leaky faucet or a broken window. This is not a broken window, Amelia. This is a collapsed foundation. And you can't fix a foundation by patching the cracks. You have to excavate, see what's rotten, and build something new." I saw the confusion in her tear-filled eyes. She didn't understand. "I love you," I said, and the words were the truest I had ever spoken. "That has not changed. That will never change. You are my daughter, my only child, the best part of me and your mother. But love and trust are two different things. They grow in the same garden, but they are not the same plant. You have broken my trust, Amelia, and trust is not a thing that can be fixed with an apology. It has to be regrown slowly over time from new soil." I gestured to the room around us, to the silent, watchful house. "This house," I said, my voice soft but firm, "is a consequence. It is the result of your choices. When you chose to stand with your husband in his plan to take it from me, you made your position clear. You chose his ambition over my history. You chose his future over our past. And because of that choice, I had to make my own. I chose to protect this house, to protect your mother's legacy in the only way I had left." I took a deep breath. This was the hardest part. "The door to my heart will always be open to you, Amelia," I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't suppress. "You can walk through that door any time you want. I will always be your father. But the door to this house, that door is no longer mine to open for you." Her face crumpled, the full, devastating weight of my words finally landing on her. "This house no longer belongs to me," I explained gently. "It belongs to the community now. It is a public space, and to enter it you have to earn your place, not as a daughter with a birthright, but as a member of the community who respects its values. And right now, honey, you are a stranger to those values." I saw a flicker of the old, entitled Amelia in her eyes. "So I'm banished," she whispered, her voice laced with a note of indignant disbelief. "You're kicking me out." "No," I said, shaking my head. "I am not kicking you out. I am asking you to leave. There is a difference. I am asking you to go out into the world and find the woman your mother and I raised. The woman who was kind, who was compassionate, who understood that a person's worth is not measured by the size of their house or the balance in their bank account. You need to find her again. You need to separate your voice from your husband's. You need to decide what you truly believe in, what you truly stand for, without him whispering the answers in your ear." This was the boundary. A line drawn not in anger, but in a painful, necessary love. It was an act of radical fatherhood. I was not abandoning her. I was forcing her for the first time in her life to stand on her own 2 feet, to face the consequences of her own decisions without a safety net. "Go," I said, my voice a quiet, final command. "Go build a new foundation, Amelia. And when you have built something strong, something true, something that is entirely your own, then you will know how to find your way back." I didn't point to the door. I didn't have to. She understood. With a final heartbroken sob, she turned. And for the second time that day, I watched my daughter walk away from me. But this time she was walking not towards a life of comfortable lies, but towards a future of difficult, painful, and necessary truth. The closing of the front door was a soft, final sound, an exclamation point at the end of a long and terrible sentence. The house was silent. But it was a silence I had not felt in years. It was not the heavy, grief-stricken silence that had descended after Rose died. It was not the tense, anxious silence of the night before, waiting for the battle. It was a new kind of quiet. It was clean. It was the calm, peaceful silence of a field after a storm has passed, the air washed clean, the ground soaked, and ready for new growth. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel a surge of vengeful satisfaction. I simply felt still. The adrenaline that had coursed through my veins for 24 hours had drained away, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. But it was a good kind of tired, the kind a man feels after a long day of honest, meaningful work, after building something that will last. I walked slowly back into the living room, my home, and I saw it with new eyes. It was no longer a fortress to be defended, a precious, fragile thing I had to protect all on my own. It was a sanctuary that had successfully weathered a siege. My hand instinctively went to the smooth, cool wood of Rose's piano. Yesterday, touching it had been an act of pain, a reminder of what I stood to lose. Today, it was an act of peace. I could think of Amelia as a little girl, her fingers clumsily finding the notes, and the memory was no longer tainted by the woman she had become. The memory itself was now protected, sealed away within these walls, part of the permanent story of this place. I imagined for the first time another child sitting here, another patient hand guiding their fingers. The thought did not bring a pang of loss. It brought a quiet, unexpected smile to my face. The music would continue. I walked to the doorframe leading to the kitchen and looked at the ladder of pencil marks that charted my daughter's growth. They were no longer a record of a personal betrayal. They were now an exhibit, a piece of history, a testament to the fact that a family had once lived and loved and grown within these walls. The pain was still there, a dull ache where my daughter used to be, but it was a private grief. It no longer threatened the house itself. The house was safe now. I had given it away. The thought was still a strange and foreign concept. I, Eli Coleman, the man who had poured the foundation and framed the walls, was no longer the owner of 127 Maple Street. But as I stood in the quiet center of the living room, I realized I had not lost a thing. I had lost the crushing weight of sole responsibility. I had lost the fear of the developers and the tax assessors. I had lost the anxiety of knowing that this place, this sacred vessel of my life with Rose, was vulnerable to the greed of the outside world and even to the greed within my own family. What had I gained? I had gained 1,000 new guardians, the trust, the community. Every person who would one day walk through these doors for a meeting or a class, they were all co-owners now. They were all stakeholders in its preservation. I was no longer a lonely old man protecting a house. I was the first custodian of a community landmark. I had not given my home away. I had given it a future. I had ensured that Rose's spirit, the spirit of welcome and community and music that she had breathed into these rooms, would never be extinguished. It would live on long after I was gone. It was a victory not of shouting, but of silence. Not of force, but of foresight. It was a victory Rose would have been proud of. And in the profound, echoing peace of the house that was no longer mine, I finally felt like I was home. A few weeks passed. The quiet that had descended upon the house after the storm of that terrible morning slowly transformed. It was no longer the silence of emptiness, but the patient, peaceful silence of a fallow field waiting for new seeds to be sown. The story of what had happened on my front porch had rippled through the neighborhood, a quiet legend passed in whispers over garden fences and in the aisles of the local grocery store. The monstrous condo project behind my house had stalled its steel skeleton, now a silent, rusting monument to a rich man's greed. I was no longer just Eli Coleman, the old man at the end of the street. I was a quiet hero, a guardian of the neighborhood's soul. People looked at me differently. They waved with a new respect, a shared understanding. They knew I hadn't just saved my own house. In a small way, I had saved a piece of theirs too. I received no word from Amelia. A part of me, the father in me, ached with that silence. But another newer part of me, the custodian, understood it was necessary. She was on her own journey now, and I had to trust that the foundations Rose and I had given her were still there, buried deep beneath the wreckage of her choices. This afternoon was the beginning. It was the first official event of the Coleman Rose Heritage Trust. It wasn't a grand gala or a formal ceremony. It was something small, something simple, something Rose would have loved. Marcus and Maya from the community center had helped me organize an after-school reading hour for the neighborhood kids. We had put up a simple flyer at the center. We expected maybe 5 or 6 children to show up. 15 came. They arrived not with the hesitant shyness of children entering a stranger's home, but with a boisterous, joyful energy, as if they somehow knew this place already belonged to them. They kicked off their shoes at the door, their colorful sneakers piling up on the welcome mat that my daughter and her husband had so recently desecrated. Maya led them into the living room, and a sound that had been absent from these walls for nearly 2 decades returned the bright, bubbling, chaotic sound of children's laughter. I sat in my armchair, the one in the corner, and I just watched. They were not intimidated by the old furniture or the quiet dignity of the room. They treated it with an easy, unconscious respect. A little girl with bright, curious eyes walked over to the piano. She didn't touch it. She just looked at it with a sense of wonder, her reflection staring back at her from the polished mahogany. I saw not an intruder, but a successor. I saw the ghost of my own 6-year-old daughter, and the memory did not bring pain. It brought a deep, profound sense of continuity. Maya, a natural storyteller, sat on the floor with them, a colorful picture book in her hands. Their little faces were rapt with attention as she read, their imaginations soaring on the wings of her words. The sound of her voice, punctuated by the children's giggles and gasps, was a new kind of music in the house, a melody of community of a future being written in real time. The house was no longer just a vessel for my memories. It was being filled with new ones. It was alive again. After the story, one of the older boys, a thoughtful-looking kid named Jamal, came over to me. He held out his hand, a serious, formal gesture. "Thank you for letting us come to your house, Mr. Coleman," he said, his voice full of a sincerity that humbled me. "It's a really nice house." I shook his small hand. "It's your house too, son," I said, and the words felt truer than anything I had ever said. "It belongs to all of us now." As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shafts of light through the living room, the parents arrived to pick up their children. They thanked me, their eyes full of a gratitude that was about more than just a free afternoon of childcare. They saw what this place could be. They saw a future for their community taking root right here in this old house that had refused to die. After they had all gone, I stood in the quiet of the living room. The air was still warm with their energy, the floor still held the faint imprint of their small crossed legs. This was it. This was the legacy. It wasn't in a will, it wasn't in a bank account, it was in the echo of a child's laughter. It was in the hope in a neighbor's eyes. I had given away my home, and in doing so I had received a treasure far greater than any I had ever owned. I had found the true meaning of wealth, and it was priceless. Respect is not a currency to be spent on the young by the old. It is the foundational bedrock of family. I learned that silence in the face of disrespect is not peacekeeping, it's self-erasure. True strength isn't found in enduring indignity, but in wielding wisdom to protect one's legacy and dignity. At 75, I didn't fight a battle of anger, but executed a strategy of truth. The house my hands built is more than wood and nails. It's a testament that you can never truly own what you do not value. I have a question for you now. Have you ever had to draw a line in the sand, not out of anger, but to protect your own peace and dignity? Let me know your story, or even just a simple yes in the comments below. It helps an old man to know he's not alone. And if my story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe. It tells me that these stories and these lessons are still worth sharing.